Hello everyone. Good morning everyone and welcome. I am Yildiray Yildirim, the director of Stephen L. Neyman Real Estate Institute here at Baruch College. We are happy to have you here to participate and share in this EB5 conference with Mona Shaw and Associate Global, David Herson Partners, and the Stephen L. Neyman Real Estate Institute. Thank you all for coming. Today we are bringing you all-day event that is all about EB5. We all know that there are many challenges when working with EB5 investment. In addition to the cloud of uncertainty surrounding reforms and the renewal of the program. And today's panel will eliminate these issues and discuss how you can succeed within the current environment. Our panelists will discuss legislative updates to the EB5 program, red flags that you may encounter in a project, rural versus urban projects, funding sources, and infrastructure. You will also hear from the representative from the USCIS Immigrant Investor Program Office. In particular, I would like to thank our special guest from the USCIS, Julia Harrison, Janelle Murray, Jan Lyons, Richard Murray, Kristen Rattigan, and Chet Breaker. Each of today's panels promises to be interesting and enlightening. Before we call for the first panel, I would like to say one more time, you're welcome and thank you. And then I'll leave the floor to Mona.
Thank you, Yildiray. Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning to everybody who's here and who's watching. It's a pleasure to be here again at Baruch, and we have a wonderful panel, so I'm not going to waste very much time because we have an awful lot that we want to speak about. I'm going to ask each of the panel members to introduce themselves briefly. No, seriously. So I will start at the end with Leon Rodriguez.
Good morning. My name is Leon Rodriguez. I am a partner at SHAH. Until January of this year, I was the director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and that came following a career as a federal prosecutor. Thank you.
Thank you, Leon. Angel? Well, you really don't need too much.
Pausing because you had such a brief introduction. It was such an understatement of who you are. I was trying to figure out how to match that. Angel Bruner, I'm president and founder of EB5 Capital. I've been in the industry about 10 years. We have investments all over the country, across all asset classes, and we have clients from over 50 countries.
Thank you. Manuel?
Yes, my name is Manuel Ortiz. I am the head of EB5 for Civitas Capital. We're based out of Dallas, Texas. We've raised over $600 million in EB5 funds. We also have a non-EB5 division that's raised $600 million as well. So total, we're about $1.2 billion, and our projects stretch throughout the United States.
Thank you. Jean?
Hi, I'm may cough a little bit, but I'm Jeannie Calderon. I've been a professor at NYU Stern School of Business for over 30 years. I teach all aspects of law, ethics, and with Gary Friedland, who is my husband of almost 40 years, we have created a course by the name of Real Estate Transactions that we teach in undergraduate, graduate, law students, and through those courses, we gained knowledge and interest, and since gaining knowledge of a EB5, we have engaged in maybe 3 years of a lot of research and writing on the field.
Thank you. Gary, would you like to say a word?
She speaks for me.
Well, they've all understated themselves. I can tell you that we are very honored to have such a panel here. And I know that everybody is dying to know what is going on, because that is the title of today's panel, Legislative Updates, EB5 and the Regs. So we're going to start, for the people who are really not sure, you hear names which are thrown out, the various players. I'm going to ask Angel. Angel, who are the players currently out there at this point?
Which game? legislative.
The EB5 legislative football game, yes.
Let's see. So we have IIUSA, Invest in the USA, for which I'm on the board of directors, and so is Dan Healy from Civitas. And I would say that's a major player,
Right.
major player in terms of policy guidance for the legislative process, and has been throughout the reauthorization conversation, which I would say is not just this year. I would say it's really just been the past 4 years that we've been having the same conversation, and I think we're going to get there this year. There's the EB5 Investment Coalition, which is a little bit newer than IIUSA. It's about 2 years old, for which I'm the membership chair and spokesperson, and that represents a broad spectrum of regional centers and actors. IIUSA has a number of affiliate members, so in addition to regional centers, I would say IIUSA represents lawyers, overseas finders, and other service providers in the industry. The third player, I would say, is the Real Estate Roundtable. The Real Estate Roundtable, for this is kind of funny. You probably know this, Mona, which is probably why I'm sitting here. I'm also a member of the Real Estate Roundtable. That's a invitation-only group of 150 real estate CEOs from around the country, and it represents, as you could imagine, all of the major real estate developers in the country that happen to use EB5. So they're new to the conversation. They've entered the conversation since we now have large developers that are involved. The fourth group that is also very powerful, which is probably the most powerful small business lobby in the country, is the Chamber of Commerce, for which I am also a member. So that group, which represents a large swath of immigration issues for folks from Marriott to Walmart to small business chapters all over the country, that group is also involved. And then the fifth group is the Rural Alliance, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a group of regional centers that have largely non-urban interests. And I say non-urban versus rural because, there's really urban, and then there's, not to understate it, but there's everything else. And so the Rural Alliance really does a very good job of representing those interests. What's interesting about the conversation right now, which has not been true before, is all of those groups are in agreement. We have all...
That's rare.
Yes, yes. And
It took 2 years to get to the stage.
yeah, and Mona can really sort of put more emphasis on that, and Leon probably can too. I cannot emphasize enough how unique that is to our moment in time right now, which is what gives me the most hope that we will actually reach a conclusion with the legislative process. Now, who are the players on the legislative side? We have friends and foes in both the House and the Senate. We have Grassley, Senator Grassley, who chairs the Judiciary for the Senate Committee. He is buffered by Jeff Sessions and Steve Miller. You probably recognize that trio as a very consistent anti-immigration trio in the conversation right now. And Senator Grassley is certainly staying true to that in the things he's asking for with reforms for the EB5 program. On the Friend side, on the Senate, we have Senator Cornyn and Senator Flake, who have been incredible champions of the program, first led, I would say, by Civitas. Civitas first introduced Senator Cornyn to the industry, and we have since befriended him as an industry, and he's been an undying champion. For those of you who don't follow Washington politics, which I hope that's most of you, Senator Cornyn is the second most powerful senator in the Senate. He is second to Senator McConnell, and so he's an incredible champion for us to have. So we're very happy with that. On the House side, I wouldn't say we have anyone who's as strong a friend as we have on the Senate side, but we do have allies, and Speaker Ryan is one of them. McCarthy is another one. And so what's important about that is that we have leadership's attention. And it's very important in this Congress to have leadership's attention, more important than it is to have any particular member of the House. And then on the not so friendly side, we have Congressman Goodlatte, which I'm pleased to say has announced his retirement yesterday. So, yes, exactly. I wish I could say I had something to do with that, but I don't. I cannot take credit for it, but I can celebrate it. And so and then the other sort of shadow character that doesn't really have any particular champion or person behind it other than Senator Grassley are the regulations. And I introduce that as an actor because that pending the pending aspect of the regulation sits in every conversation we have about what to do about the legislation.
Thank you, Angel. And we're going to come back to the regulations in a big way shortly. But really, Manuel, I know Civitas have a lot to do with what's going on. They've helped tremendously in the in bringing in legislation. But you also travel widely. What are you seeing with this stalemate? For 2 years, we've had this stalemate as far as new legislation is concerned.
Right, and so I would say in just getting feedback from intermediaries and just talking to some of the investors ourselves, over the course of the last few years, there's been the looming changes coming, and you've had different deadlines, and I think the fact that sometimes it seems like the goalposts kept moving back, I wouldn't say that you lose some credibility at the fact that the investment amount's going to go up, TA is going to change, but people just start kind of wondering, is this really going to happen? And so I think one of the things that has been one of the major concerns just throughout the world has been that the investment amount would change, and I do think that is going to have a dampening effect on the demand. And so I would think just we as regional centers would also be working with a smaller pool of investors. Now, I think that's going to be very important for the projects that are out there because the smaller pool of investors is also very important because other countries, which are the emerging markets such as India, Latin America, don't have the infrastructure that China did. And so in the case of China, the infrastructure to distribute EB5 exists there. In other countries, that does not exist. And so because of that, the timing to fund for certain projects is going to be a lot longer. And so I think that definitely does have to coincide with the type of projects that are out there, and also just the different perspectives and preferences that investors have in different parts of the world and how they perceive projects.
That's right. But Angel, Manuel, what are you seeing as far as the legislation going through? There is a very good chance, or do you see there is a good chance of the regs coming in if there isn't a deal?
I would say two things there. One, I agree with Manuel that they're moving the goalposts, that we've been incredibly cooperative as an industry. We've been incredibly aligned as an industry, more so than ever before, Mona, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
And as we agree, they bring up new things for us to agree on. So there's definitely a feeling over the past 3 months that the goalposts keep getting moved and that there are people who are actively trying to run out the clock and have more interest in the regulations coming into play than actual reform and legislation through the legislative process. So that is a factor. We are doing everything we can as an industry across all of those groups to get to a legislative solution, but we have not seen any draft legislative language, and the clock is running.
Yeah, we have till April of next year.
Right, so even if we agree on 10 issues, it really doesn't matter if we don't start drafting legislation. So that is critical. That's something everyone in this room can do, is to encourage their congressmen to push for draft language, but the regs have a process to go through.
Right.
They have to go to OMB. They have not actually started that process, so we do have some time. I think it's highly unlikely that we will be governed by the regs anytime soon.
Well, that's a matter of opinion, I think, from what we've been hearing. Leon,
Yeah.
I know you're of the opinion that perhaps the regs may not come in because you are aware of all the formalities that have to go through.
Well, and I've also been watching the political dynamic that began while I was still director. So just to sort of remember the timing of what happened was the legislation was about to sunset. Senator Grassley had a number of what I would characterize as sort of program integrity questions about the EB-5 program, sent a very long, very detailed letter demanding all kinds of reform. So right about the spring of 2016, we began the process of drafting the regulation. There was all kinds of stakeholder input. That then is followed by, one, the election outcome, which obviously shifts the players, but two, the fact that the regulation sunsets, the law is rather sunsets and is extended repeatedly. And what the regulation has become as a result is more of a bargaining lever in the legislative process than really a reality in and of itself. And I think I would hasten to point out two other players that I would add to the mix in terms of Angel's array, which is one, the leadership of USCIS. And it's important to understand that the leadership of USCIS is almost the same as Chuck Grassley, in the sense that the head of the Office of Policy at USCIS, Kathy Newell-Kavarick, was a senior staffer for Chuck Grassley until she was appointed over at USCIS. She has really been determining a lot of the policy direction for USCIS. And the director, who was confirmed just 3 weeks ago, was somebody who was detailed from the Department of Homeland Security to USCIS. That means that his views, if nothing else, will have a lot of access to the internal process at USCIS. But there's another player within the executive branch that cannot be ignored, and that is the bureaucracy itself, the Immigrant Investor Office, the IPO, which you all know. They have somewhat different priorities than the political process. They want a law that they can actually administer. They don't want to have things keep changing, so they don't want to issue a regulation today only to find that there is a law 3 months later that overtakes what that regulation says. All of those dynamics for me spell that for the foreseeable future, the regulation will continue to be a bargaining lever, but something for which there is not presently active intention in the executive branch. And I don't know, I'm not in there anymore, people don't talk to me, I'm just observing the dynamics from the outside, which is that it is basically functioning as a lever. Now, to Mona's question about the actual process, it will need to go over to the Office of Management and Budget. Picture the BQE on a bad day. That is the line of regulations waiting to be approved. So unless that regulation is one where the White House, in other words, the president or his immediate staff, have said this regulation is a priority that must jump to the front of the line, that regulation will wait there for a while before it's actually cleared for issuance, not to mention that pretty significant questions might be asked about that regulation during the course of the process. If the regulation is actually issued, there are then another 30 days, a minimum of 30 days, before which that regulation can become effective. And this is another place where the bureaucracy becomes very important. The bureaucracy wants enough time from the time that that regulation is issued to the time that it becomes actually in effect to be able to be ready, meaning it needs to train the adjudicators to be ready to handle the cases. They need to issue external guidance to the industry in order to be able to comply. There's a number of they need to change forms. There's a number of things that they need to do, which means that 30 days often becomes 60, 90, and even 120 days. So there's, again, my prediction is that we're still going to be dealing mostly with the legislative process rather than the regulatory process.
Leon, whenever I travel, and I know Manuel faces the same, people ask us, oh, can they close down the EB-5 program? And we explain that no, the EB-5 program itself is in law, but the regional center program is not. And in your opinion, I don't believe you believe that the regional center program can be closed down.
I don't believe it can be closed down. I think it can be gummed up plenty. In other words, I think that there are ways that you can, in fact, I think we've seen in different immigration, not just the EB-5 world, but if you look at what's happening in the other parts of the employment-based world, there is a lot that you can do in the adjudicative process that will slow an industry down. So it may not shut it down, and I don't think they can shut it down or will shut it down, but there is plenty that can be done to sort of really inhibit activity within an industry.
Well, I'll come back to this point in a second, in a few minutes, Leon. Jean and Gary, you both have spent an awful lot of effort, time, thought power, brain power in examining how EB-5 financing has really benefited the community and what improvements can be done. How do you see, if we get the regulations coming in as opposed to legislation, how do you see that affecting the infrastructure which is already out there?
I think that, well, we actually released a paper in February right after the regulations were proposed. We're entitled Missed Opportunity. We believe that while the idea of TEA reform is a good thing, the way that they approached it was possibly not the most prudent approach. The timing was poor, obviously. If regulations were proposed in the spring or summer of 2016, we think they never would have gone into effect, but it would have been the impetus for real negotiation and a compromise that would result in legislation similar to what's been offered by Senator Grassley now, maybe a little bit tougher. I think as a practical matter, by the delay, it invites the problems that Leon just pointed out. So I think as a practical matter, the more likely solution is or outcome is that there will not be any reform in the current session. And I think the better approach by USCIS would be to simplify the regulations. And with one simple change, it would have, I think, more likely facilitated a compromise and not be subject to the same kind of attack as is being offered now. And the simple change would be to simply revoke the delegation of TEA authority from the states and revert to what the statute provides, which is that USCIS makes that determination. You would then have a $500,000 and $1 million level. You wouldn't have to adjust the investment amounts. You wouldn't be facing and raising the same issues that are being raised now by what the impact of dramatic increases in the investment amounts would be.
But how far do you feel that if the regulations come in as they currently stand, it's going to hurt big cities like New York City, of course?
I think that it's certainly hard to measure the impact, but certainly when you increase dramatically the investment amount, it's going to result in a reduction in the number of investors who can afford the program,
yeah,
and will consider other options. On the other hand, increasing the investment amount not to quite the levels that were offered in the regulations, which I think as a practical matter were offered more as a hammer and not really as a sincere targeted amount, particularly given that they were offered in the context of legislation that was pending, which offered investment amounts at that point of $800,000 and $1 million. And even that the reformers were unable to get past. They knew there would be tremendous resistance. So but on the other hand, by increasing the investment amount, you're able to raise more investment dollars with fewer investors. Essentially, half the number of investors can raise the same amount of money, number one. And number two is it would have some positive impact on the long visa waiting line, because you wouldn't have as many investors online to raise the same amount of money. As a practical matter, though, I think the $1.8 million, $1.35 million would have some kind of impact.
Well, now I throw this out to the whole panel because the issue really is here. This is what I feel, that all the people who get involved with legislation, they really don't understand the competition that the United States faces when we go overseas. Because someone sitting, for example, in the UAE who wants to, an expat sitting in the UAE who wants to come and live somewhere else in the world doesn't just have the United States. They have Australia, they have Canada, they have the UK, they have basically the whole world. And the United States is a unique program in the sense that your money is at risk. So whether it is feasible to allow somebody to put 1.8 million at risk with no guarantees and no promises, and whether you can really expect that you're going to get the same kind of numbers to fill up private business, I throw that open to the panel.
I mean,
Yes.
it's my opinion that if, and I agree with Gary, that if the investment amount increases to 800 and to $1 million, that might shrink the market a little bit, but not all that much. And I really do think that a lot of the stuff that's putting the market on the fence right now are the processing times. So to Leon's point, there are things that can happen that can kind of suppress that market. And one of the things that we're seeing right now are just that the processing times are taking very long, and that in and of itself is dampening some of that demand. And I think if you look at some of the emerging markets like Vietnam and India, who aren't at the delays that, say, China is, they'll be there sometime within the next 2 to 3 years. And so that, again, can also dampen the demand.
One point that confuses me is that Angel points out that industry accepts the terms that have been offered by Senator Grassley, which is quite different from what's been proposed in the past. And so the question is, what points are open? What points has Senator Grassley, what new points has Senator Grassley imposed that are not acceptable to industry?
I'm so glad you asked that question because they're new points. They're not the points that he originally asked us to accept. We accepted all those. The latest issue that I think that we have violent disagreement on, and me especially, is Senator Grassley would like to lower the job creation requirement. He would like to see, instead of us having to create 10 jobs, he would like to have us create 5 jobs in rural communities, and only 10 jobs in every place else. And if there's one tenet that I would like to preserve, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to do it, is the job creation opportunity that we have that's different than any other country. And so I've personally said that I won't accept that. And I'm happy to see that industry has followed my lead on that, and that we're holding tight to that line. But that's probably the most offensive thing that Senator Grassley has come to us with since we agreed to everything.
So for clarification purposes, I don't know how many in the audience are familiar with the fact that Senator Grassley and Congressman Goodlatte have issued a term sheet that you've actually written about that describes the new proposed terms, which includes that term, and that's been floating around for over a month or two. So as far as that being a new term, I'm a little bit confused. But as far, maybe you should discuss what some of the new terms are.
Right. Well, Angel, there was a proposal thrown out about a month ago as to a last and final offer. And it was like nothing is going to change after this offer. That was the implication.
Right, so there was an offer before that.
Right.
To which there was a term sheet before that to which we agreed to. And then once we agreed to that, then the new term sheet was circulated with this additional term. I guess there's a component of our community that would like to see that term that's in the minority.
Yeah, I think the 5 jobs issue, just for clarification, I think relates solely to rural projects, rural and urban distress. I don't think it's not across the board. So it would still remain 10 jobs, 1 direct, 9 indirect for so-called TEA.
Right, so what we countered with was we feel so strongly about job creation that we offered that you can have 10 for rural, but we'll increase the job requirement for everywhere else to 12. And that's how strongly we feel about the economic development component of the program, and how strongly we believe that we can meet that without any erosion of the capital that we can bring to a project.
And there's a, sorry, Gary.
Yeah, well, but as a practical matter, every project that qualifies for the 10 will qualify for the 12 because the market currently demands a job cushion of at least 20%. And the way that jobs are calculated is based, in many cases, particularly for real estate development projects, on the amount of construction expenses. That really drives the calculation. So you're creating temporary, you're creating construction jobs in many cases, and I think Senator Grassley's point is that in the case of rural projects, which don't have the opportunity to create as many construction type jobs, but are trying to create jobs in the manufacturing sector, it's not as easy to justify based on economic impact models those number of jobs.
It's actually the opposite. What happens in a rural area is that the transport cost and the number of ancillary inputs is increased because of the distance between inputs. And so what you have in rural areas, for example, in our first project in Sugarbush, for every job we created at Sugarbush, we created 3 jobs in the Mad River Valley. And we don't get those kind of multipliers in urban areas because you don't have the same transport distances. So you actually have an opportunity for more jobs in rural areas. Secondly, we asked Senator Grassley's office to tell us just exactly what type of investments would require 5 jobs. What type of jobs would you be creating that you would need such a low job creation requirement? And they didn't answer the question. We've eventually got an answer to the question, and we got a franchise answer. Now, I personally want to create high wage, living wage jobs, and those don't fit that definition to me. And so I'm personally not interested in creating those jobs. I don't think that that's good for the community, not to mention the ancillary sort of negative impacts of that kind of thing. I mean, you're talking about health issues, and I just don't think those are the best jobs for us to create for those communities.
And that's actually a larger objection than, for example, the set-aside?
Yes, absolutely. It's a deal breaker.
Yeah, we should explain that in the latest proposal, 3,000 visas were put as set-asides. And I think, Angel, you said that what was not agreeable was the fact that if those set-asides weren't used, they were not allowed to roll over to the visas. The current visa capacity.
That's right. Senator Grassley's office feels very strongly that they would like to see permanent set-asides, to which we've agreed to. The industry has agreed to permanent set-asides, and we understand that we need to create some significant long-term advantages or competitive advantages for the rural communities so that they can compete, and we're committed to that. But we still want strong living wage jobs for those communities. We don't want to create just any job. We have the choice, and we want to exercise it.
So if, again, going back to you, Leon, we can't get into agreement. Regs come in. We don't like what's in the regs. Can the regs be challenged?
Sure. I mean, I think regs can always be challenged, and the fact of challenging has an impact. You can challenge that they're beyond the legislative authority. You can challenge that they're not based in the record, which is something I think you're going to see happening a fair amount, actually, not just in the EB5 world, but down the line. So those are definitely tools that will be available. Now, it's unlikely that those challenges will necessarily stop the regs from going into effect. So you may be fighting for a long time, while the regs are actually in effect. So that's something to consider, whether you think the case to challenge them will be strong enough to actually stop them from going into effect. We'll see how smart the lawyers turn out to be.
So if somebody wants to keep the status quo, and they allow, they keep fighting, we keep having all these infightings, like a filibuster in a way, and we come to April, we go through the procedures and formalities, regs are coming in. There isn't a way to retain the current status quo of 500,000 and what we currently see in the TEA?
So one thing about the April date, I assume when people talk about the April date, they're talking about the date in the regulatory agenda.
Right.
That is a purely notional date, just to be clear, in terms of what that date means. That is, USCIS was asked What's your regulatory agenda? When do you think this reg will be ready to go? And that's the date that was put there. I have seen regs. I have run agencies where regs have waited 2 years and even 3 years before they actually got issued. So I mean, I think it's important to understand while that's there as a target of sorts, the reality is that it could go well past that date when it actually gets issued.
Just a question on top of that. In your previous experience,
Can you come get closer to the mic?
yeah, sure. In your previous experience where it took that long, were those regs in contention or were those regs not in contention?
Excellent question. And so in the particular case that I'm remembering, it actually was not a reg that was in contention. Rather, this was part of a sort of pre-election pause in the Obama administration where there was a concern about being perceived as issuing too many burdensome regulations, so we waited. I mean, the dynamic was somewhat different than the one we're talking about here.
And there's nothing in the Administrative Procedure Act or any other type of law that requires that OMB actually act within any time frame?
The main thing is just once OMB gets it, it's supposed to act within 90 days. But OMB doesn't have it right now. And again, OMB, for everybody to understand, conducts the regulatory review. They do the cost-benefit analysis. They ensure that the Administrative Procedure Act is being followed. So that's the one deadline that I'm aware of. I don't think there is a longer horizon deadline in terms of from date of proposed rule to actual issuance, that there's a deadline that is an enforceable
And
deadline.
that even if it were enacted or finalized, then there would be the opportunity for industry possibly to resume negotiations with Congress to try to come up with a reform.
Absolutely. And again, this is where the Immigrant Investor Office becomes a pretty important voice, because I know, for example, if I was still director and you told me, today we're going to issue this regulation, we're going to begin to administer this regulation, but 6 months from now we're going to have a law that's going to change everything all over again, I would have a lot of problems with that. So I think the professionals who will have to actually administer that will very actively resist a situation where that scenario seems like something that will happen.
Leon, Angel, what about new visas, visa issuances, or perhaps fixing the current situation whereby dependents get taken out of the current 10,000 cap? Has that come up in discussions? Do we have any room for negotiations?
Yeah.
Again, for reasons that I think everybody can understand, I'm outside of the legislative process. I will observe an important dynamic that's going on. You have an administration that has, first of all, supported the RAISE Act, which has created sort of this merit-based framework for immigration in the future, has argued for lowering overall immigration to half the current levels. So whatever happens with this issue, and I have no specific knowledge on where this issue is going in terms of the counting of the dependents, the fact is that the position both of the executive branch and significant parts of the majority in Congress has been toward reducing numbers just about everywhere else, which I think is going to make it very challenging, at least in the short horizon, to really raise numbers in this world. And this is my soapbox moment where I say I actually think the number should be 10 times more without dependents even being counted for this to really realize its full benefit. And I'm going to say that at every conference I speak at for the next few years,
Amen.
until it
I
actually
agree,
happens.
yes.
Could you
But-
please explain what the benefit would be to us, not to immigrants?
The benefit is that you look at the Department of Commerce report, I think was looking at fiscal 13 and 14. You look at the levels of job creation. You look at the levels of cash infusion into the economy. Just looking at the levels of job creation, we are thrilled if we have a month where our unemployment rate drops by 1/10%. That's roughly, given our workforce size, somewhere between 200 and 250,000 jobs. That means that in those 2 years, the level of job creation that the Department of Commerce studied amounted to about 3 months of positive job creation. Just as one measure of the benefit of the program, I think the benefits are much more than just job creation, not to mention all the indirect job creation. So it just basically brings more positive investment into our economy. So I mean, I think that's why that kind of expansion would be positive. I also take this moment, which is, I think the absence of state and local economic development managers, state and local officials from conferences like this one is a big problem, because they would be the most important political allies to this industry. I don't think they've been mobilized on the level they need to be.
And Leon, I would agree completely with what you just said on the local level. And Angel, your group does a very good job in putting projects together. And just on a micro level, in terms of what's happened in Dallas, one of the projects that we did a few years ago, it's one of our first projects, was a section in Dallas that was very underdeveloped. It was somewhat of a place that you don't want to be in if it gets too late at night. And so lenders were not lending in that area. And so that's where EB5 came into play as a local economic development tool. And so we helped the developer develop the first full-service hotel south of what's I-30 there since World War II. Well, since then, Dallas Police Department has located right across the street. It's transformed the area. It's a place where you do want to be at night because there's a lot of restaurants. It's got a very vibrant nightlife. And so I think those stories need to be told more too, and totally agree on that local level thing that you mentioned.
Angel,
But
where
that needs to be talked about in the context of TEA reform so that there truly will be motivation by the investors to invest in projects in those areas rather than in the safer areas that are less risky of their investment, where really the EB5 capital is not making a difference.
And under the Grassley reform or offer, the TEA the TEA incentive will now be narrowed to $100,000. So effectively, the TEA financial incentive is meaningless, and the focus becomes the visa set-asides. If I'm optimistic, or I think that there will be comprehensive immigration reform, and that will provide an avenue for EB5 to gain more slots. If that's the case, there will be no incentive for TEA. That's
Well,
something just to be taken into account.
just in case people are not quite sure, is that the latest proposal was figures at 925 for TEA and $1,025,000, so only 100,000 difference. Is that what you meant? Angel, quickly, integrity measures, are they being opposed? Are they being approved?
No, I'm pleased to say, so I first asked USCIS to regulate us to a greater extent in 2008, and I thought I was going to need a security escort from the room from my fellow EB5 operators. But I come from an institutional background, and so for folks like us and for folks like Civitas, the world won't change with integrity measures. My life at 9 a.m. the day before and 9 a.m. the day after.
How are they being viewed? Any opposition?
They're being viewed very positively by all the different industry groups. We seem to be now. The caveat to this is we have not seen draft legislation. So we're talking about agreeing on language that was in the Flake bill, agreeing on language that's in the Cornyn bill. We're not actually talking about agreeing on language as it will be proposed to us. But given the past language that's been proposed to us, we're largely in agreement. And we've actually come to them and said, hey, your language is good, but it's not great. We actually want it to be stronger because some of the more recent incidences of fraud would not be deterred by your language. And so we've actually asked them to strengthen it in certain areas in terms of reporting and monitoring and oversight.
Gary, you had a point?
Yeah, I think that Senator Cornyn is the wrong person to be leading. I think Senator Cornyn is the wrong person to be leading that front, because the one provision in the reform bills, most recently the reform bill proposed by Chairman Goodlatte, pardon the expression, he introduced a provision that was aimed specifically at curbing the J-peak anti-fraud abuse. And when
Could
Senator
you
Cornyn...
detail, could you detail the language that you're
Yeah,
referring
I'll
to?
detail it in a second. I'm happy to. As far as the Senator Cornyn in the spring, he circulated a draft bill. It wasn't introduced, but it was a draft bill circulated to the stakeholders, and that eliminated the provision that Representative Goodlatte proposed. And Representative Goodlatte's provision was really aimed to deter fraud, to detect it early, and then to enhance the discovery. The way the system is right now, USCIS doesn't get involved to tracking the flow of funds until the I-829 stage, which, as you know, in many cases is at least 4 years down the road, if not longer. So there's no mechanism to control the funds. And if you look at the various SEC actions, that's a common theme that would have been curbed by something that Representative Goodlatte proposed, which was two alternatives. The most recent one of which was to require an independent fund administrator who would sign off on the transfer of funds and be possibly a co-signatory on that, to require that there be separate accounts, not the commingling accounts, rather than end up with the type of situations you have in JPEAK, where a spaghetti diagram really represents what the flow of funds are. They're so convoluted. Rather than just going escrow from the investor to the escrow to the NCE to JCE, it follows a circuitous path throughout the world. So that's something that was eliminated in the Cornyn proposal. So I'm very curious to see whether that survives in a bill that may get introduced.
Thank you, Gary. Angel, Leon, do we have a dictator in Senator Grassley? And is there any challenge from the leadership?
No. Yeah, no. This is a very influential and powerful senator, and I think he does have some potential to be a veto of one. I don't know that I would necessarily characterize him as a dictator, but I do think he is he has created a space where he has a veto power, an almost disproportionate veto power over what's going to be happening here.
Angel?
I don't think he has veto power, actually. I think that he has created certainly a fiefdom in terms of the appointment of Kathy Newbold, and that he has
And Cisna.
And Cisna, and
yeah.
he has created an incredible amount, a disproportionate amount of influence, but that at the end of the day, that if he continues to sort of use the regs as a lever to extract more and more concessions from the industry, that I don't actually think that will end well for him, because of the process of the literal process of the regulations, and then our legal avenues to oppose the regulations. So I don't think the power equation that he's working with will actually end the way that he would like it to if he were a dictator. So
And can leadership override?
yes, technically yes.
Right.
Yeah,
So
agreed. Yeah.
We are running out of time very, very rapidly. We've run out, but I do want to open the floor for any questions. Yes.
Why would you oppose 85 jobs in rural areas?
Question was, sorry, why would you...
Why would anybody oppose lowering the number of jobs for rural areas?
That's a great question. It's a philosophical opposition to the lowering of any job creation requirement for the program. It's independent of rural or urban, without a economically defensible argument as to what jobs are you creating and why would you need to do that, which Senator Grassley's office did not provide. There's no opportunity for us to support the lowering of jobs. Give us an economic argument and we'll consider it. We haven't been given one.
Lack of jobs in rural areas created the situation we found ourselves in.
Lack of economic opportunity in rural areas, not lack of jobs.
And economic opportunity is that they will create, put us in a condition we're in now. Scary condition. We need to encourage rural areas, people that are out of work, by investing in those rural areas and
Absolutely.
That would throw immigrants into rural areas and then scare them.
So that is why we are supporting the set-aside program and the permanent set-asides, because we want rural areas to have a permanent economic advantage in raising EB5 funds.
And a follow-up question unrelated to this. We have been always following investing in job creation and real estate development, hotels and other real estate development projects. Why don't we change the emphasis on creating manufacturing jobs, preferably in green energy, green jobs? So coal industry created 7,000 jobs versus a couple million.
Sorry, hi, can you use the mic? The mic
would
is
you mind
right
going
there.
to the mic,
Yeah.
sir? How many follow-up questions do you want to offer?
Loud enough. I always am. The emphasis has always been in investing in job creation in the real estate industry, be it hotels, be it residential, be it office. The emphasis should also spread to creating green jobs in green energy creation, clean energy manufacturing. Why not change the direction or make the emphasis in changing the direction to spread the investments from just real estate investment and job creation to manufacturing job creation?
With respect, I don't think the investments are just real estates. We have many projects where we are not talking about just real estate. There are manufacturing, there are alternative type of projects, infrastructure, transportation, agriculture. So it isn't just in real estate. But I see your point, if anybody wants to
majority
answer.
has been real estate. I've been doing it for 10
Well,
years.
real estate has hijacked the EB5 program, but it isn't intended just for real estate, and there are not just real estate projects, and we've had a lot of success in non-real estate projects as well. There's somebody at the back? Yes. Could you take the mic, please? I know everybody thinks they think we can hear you, but we want to make sure everyone can hear you.
Well, you can't see me from behind that thing. Hi, Ozzy Torres. How are
Hi,
you?
Ozzy.
Thank you, everyone. You've done a marvelous job. So we all understand that there are various players right now trying to get this done. What role does the Chamber of Commerce play, and are they a stranglehold right now?
I would say no, as someone who's deeply involved in the conversations on a weekly basis. Everyone is incredibly cooperative right now. It's a different world than it was 2 years ago. Everyone is incredibly cooperative. That's all I could say, that there are no outliers.
I think everybody's in agreement that we want this program to succeed and we want this program to move forward. Yes? All right. Any last questions? Yes.
You were saying earlier.
Can you take the mic, please? Sorry.
How about I talk loud? You were saying earlier that.
It's for the recording.
You were saying earlier that there was an issue with the regs, and you were earlier saying that it's going to expire April of 2018, but there's a likelihood it's going to be renewed. With that being said, what regs are you referring to, or is it going to be universal with regs A, or primarily what I'm more interested in is Reg D?
Okay, I think we're not talking just about the security regulations. What we're talking about here, the regulations which were introduced by USCIS.
They were primarily aimed at, they were issued on January 13th of this year, and they were primarily aimed at TEA reform, but not only.
All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you to our panel, and thank you to our audience. The next panel.
because there wasn't really much of a break in between. I didn't get that really actual 15-minute break.
No.
Let me just tell them that if everyone can take their seats. Hi, if everyone can take their seats, please. We're going to begin the next panel. Thank you. We're going to begin our panel 2, SEC, the red flag. When does a project raise a red flag?
I'd like to thank everyone for being here, and I'd like to thank Baruch College for hosting us again. We're going to start with introductions, starting with Clem.
Okay, let's see. Who am I? So,
just read the post.
right. My name is Clem Turner. I lead the corporate and securities practice group at Barr, Smoot, Kamal and Kleiner, which happens to be the oldest immigration firm in the United States. So it's fun to lead the corporate group there. I've been in EB5 since 2010. I've represented hundreds of regional centers and projects over the course of those 7 years. My clients have raised probably a couple of $1 billion through the EB5 program in that space. And, my bio's in here, so I'll leave it at that.
Brian?
Yes, you've got my bio in there. I'm the CEO of Icon Compliance Services. We handle investigations, monitoring, and forensic accounting of these EB5 projects. We get called when things go wrong, and sometimes it's pretty nasty when we do get called in, and we have to act very fast by strategizing what we have to do. And the bulk of our staff is former federal agents like myself and federal prosecutors. I'm a special agent who retired from the U.S. Treasury and Homeland Security. And my bio's in there.
Ozzy?
Good morning, everyone. My name's Ozzy Torres. I'm a Cuban immigrant. I grew up in Brooklyn, not too far from here. I started work here in a big firm in New York City. I'm presently in Fort Lauderdale, and for the past 30 years, I've been doing solely corporate and securities work. For the past 6 years, heavily immersed in EB5 work, and I'm very pleased to be here with you.
Sam?
Hi, everyone. Sam Silverman, Managing Partner of EB5 Affiliate Network. We're a national EB5 consulting regional center operator. We have 15 regional centers that cover 21 states, and we work with clients, primarily real estate developers and project developers, looking to structure the full set of EB5 documents for their projects and bring them to market under an approved regional center. Thank you.
And I'm Omar Hakim. I'm the corporate and securities attorney at Mona Shaw & Associates. So we've kind of broken down the program by types of red flags. We've identified 7 different areas that we're going to be discussing. The first area is immigration risk. Basically, the most important thing to any investor is that their investment meets the requirements of the EB5 program. Otherwise, they will not be able to get their green card, which is the entire purpose of making the investment. The second red flag is the EB5 team. So does a person, the economists, the attorneys, the service providers, do they have experience in EB5? The third bucket we're talking about is, we identified it as a glossary, basically certain words that you do not want to see or hear from the promoters. For example, guarantee. There's no guarantees in life, and it's definitely not allowed in the EB5 program. The fourth thing is the marketing and promotion. How is the project being marketed? Intuitively you can kind of tell, if someone seems to be honest or if they're kind of, using unethical tactics. And we've also identified some specific areas in EB5. The third is structural and conflict issues. Like basically, there's many different players in an EB5 project, and what conflicts of interest do those parties have, and how are they being managed? And the sixth one is financial controls, which kind of ties into structural and conflict issues, meaning what financial controls are put in place to make sure that there's someone overseeing the money every time it moves from one entity to another, and make sure it's done in a way that's to the benefit of the investor and prevents fraud. And the final bucket we've identified is management, just the background and the reputation of the people actually running the project, and more than reputation, their experience and ability to deliver on what they're on the project they're trying to sell you. So we're going to start with immigration risk, and do you want to kick us off on that?
Sure, thank you. So immigration risks, and I was just discussing with Clem. I'm not an immigration lawyer, but chances are if there's an immigration risk, there's probably a securities law risk. So I'm just going to just go through a few of them real fast and then dive a little deeper into some others. So obviously, guaranteed return or redemption should raise a red flag. These days, the use of side letters, bridge financing that appears to be too long, a project that's outside the TEA zone should raise a red flag. Tenant occupancy should raise a red flag. A job cushion that's just too tight. Reliance on operational jobs. Now, that may not be an SEC issue, but certainly it's something to look at from an immigration perspective. Of course, outdated TEAs, construction jobs that you're relying on that are over 2 years. Then you might come across some land issues where it's not clear who has title, the title hasn't been transferred, or they're trying to step up the valuation on the land and you don't have a proper appraisal evaluation. That's very common. Let's focus just for a second on really one of the first cardinal sins, which is guaranteed return or redemption. So it was in the matter of Izumi where it was held that, or stated that, to enter into a redemption agreement at the time of making an investment evidences a preconceived intent to unburden oneself of the investment as soon as possible after unconditional permanent residence is attained. So there, it was likened to the person who gets married and puts in writing that they are going to be divorced in 2 years. That's pretty strong stuff, right? So I just read it just a few minutes ago, and I think we should all read Izumi every once in a while because actually it's rich. And it's the heart of this program. And talking about the heart of the program, an esteemed colleague of mine mentioned that, this is about immigration. And yet, Inra Izumi said, the focus here is on the green card and not on the business. And that's what was found to be objectionable. So let's think about that for a moment, right? This is an immigration program, but the vehicle is a business. And so we need to focus on the business aspect of it. And that's just a sort of, to the extent it's a gem, I just wanted to share that with you. And we can go on to other points now. So the use of side letters. Clem, I'm going to pick on you. Should we allow the use of side letters in SEC offerings?
Well, I don't know if it would necessarily be a red flag, but usually when a side letter is employed, one or a small group of investors is getting some kind of a special deal or a special accommodation. And to the extent that's being used in order to facilitate, I'll say it this way, to the extent that's being used for a marketing reason, they're desperate for investors, and so they're sweetening the pot, so to speak. That can certainly be a red flag to those investors as well as to regulators, that there's some issue with the project.
I would agree with that. I mean, you should always look at anything that smells and sounds like a side letter or something to really think about. I think that's true.
Go
ahead.
Just to follow up on that, I think what's critical though is the side letter. Is it being disclosed to USCIS? Is it being disclosed to a potential regulator, or is the person raising money, is the issuer really attempting to do something covertly? Because I have used side letters, or I have clients that have used side letters, in very transparent ways. I've not had a client try to do something covertly, but I suspect if I do, that would probably not be a continued client of mine.
So we can provide in the PPM that there may be the use of side letters, and that should cure, hopefully, any disclosure issue. But again, we need to remember that offerings should be, uniform. And to the extent that investors are getting different deals, that's not so good. Sam, you run a lot of regional centers. Anything that pops out for you?
When we're thinking about risk for projects, we typically look at both immigration and financial risk, right? So on the immigration side, it's really what's the likelihood of the jobs, the 10 jobs being in place for the project, right? And for that to be true, you've got to look at, execution risk. Is it already under construction? What's the likelihood of all the financing coming together, right? Separate from that, you've got, the TEA letter and the regional center being approved and active. Those are pretty easy to check though. It's more of what's the likelihood that this project is going to successfully create the jobs, right? So a safer project is one where it's fully financed, construction's underway, maybe there are already jobs that have already been created. That's going to be a lot lower risk than something that's, just a rendering and maybe there's a letter of intent from a lender, but there's no equity in place or the land hasn't closed. Things like that are going to be, red flags for just a higher risk project. Not a project that's not going to be approvable, but just one that's going to be of greater risk, right? And then on the financial side, it's basically, is the capital structure fully capitalized? Is it intact? And is the project totally reliant on EB5 financing? That's really the threshold issue. If only one investor signed up for the EB5 in that particular project, they're looking for $10 million, only one person signs up, does the project move forward or not? And how likely or how sure are you that that's true, right? That's really the key question.
And a lot of the immigration risks actually tie into project risk. For example, having a fully financed project, having the project already starting construction, that gives you more confidence that you're going to get your money back and that you're going to get your green card. So next we're going to discuss the EB5 team. Obviously,
Yeah, the team is important. I'll talk to you guys about team a little bit. And I think the last conversation brought up some technical issues that some of you guys may not be aware of, and maybe the SEC isn't necessarily aware of without drilling heavily down into EB5. The EB5 team, frankly, is a very easy red flag that you can identify if the team if the team is inexperienced. And I think first off, an inexperienced team basically signals that the developer or the issuer putting that raise together is being penny wise and pound foolish. As we just talked about, there are a lot of issues that are immigration related that impact the securities work, impact what the economist does, impact the corporate law, and to the extent a team is inexperienced and doesn't know that, you can get documents that are not going to pass muster with USCIS. Also, sometimes inexperienced teams tend to, be less diligent on disclosure, less diligent with vetting projects, and these are all top-level things as to why the team matters. However, I can quickly dig a little deeper and explain to you why this red flag should particularly matter to investors and the SEC. The immigration impacts of having an inexperienced regional center or immigration lawyer are obvious, and we kind of talked about them. From a corporate perspective, and Ozzy can weigh in on this, there are certain corporate governance structures that go into place in an EB5 deal that are not in place in a corporate deal. For example, a prohibition on redemption until the 829 is adjudicated, which an average corporate lawyer is going to have no idea what that means.
Right, so it's not just regular experience. So someone could be doing corporate law for 30 years, but that's not necessarily going to help them.
That's not necessarily going to help them.
And that's where I see some issues, right? Sometimes you have a big fancy law firms where all of us might have come from, and it's a little troubling that they do great work, of course, but they just don't get certain aspects of it.
Yeah, that's one example. Another example is guaranteeing a redemption. I'm just speaking corporately. Another example is it's very typical in corporate law when funds are paid back to investors that's deemed a return of capital because that has tax advantages.
That's a good point.
Yet a return of capital in EB5 means all of your investors get denied. So they had great tax treatment, but they have to go home. So an inexperienced team in EB5 should certainly raise a red flag to those of you who are who are viewing this as potential investors, but also, regulatorily, can definitely have impacts. And along those lines, I do have a story about an economist, which I shared with Omar. I had a client a while ago, before USCIS had their own economists. I had a client who had a relationship with an economist that had never done EB5 before, but was a very well-respected economist. And, it's just RIMS too. It's just implant, for those of you who are familiar with EB5. The mechanism in which job creation is formulated is not unique to EB5. So this economist did an economic analysis, and, long story short, it was a complete nightmare. USCIS is used to getting the information that they get, the way that they get it, and how they get it. And this economist just used a different format, and it completely confused the adjudicator, and it turned into many rounds of RFEs and a year delay. Loyalty is great, but in terms of EB5, it can have real consequences using inexperienced people. From an SEC perspective, the team is usually described in the business plan and or the PPM. It's very easy to see what the qualifications of the team are, and certainly, from an investment perspective, that's a question you should ask. And from a regulatory perspective, I believe that that's something that they look at.
Sam, you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so when we look at project documents as the regional center, we have 15 centers that cover 21 states, and probably looked at about 300 or so projects over the last 5 years. What we see is it's not so much the team members. You often don't find a law firm particularly, that's doing their first EB5 offering and is going to try to wing it or just start from scratch. Most of the vendors that we see have done more than one EB5 transaction, so they're not typically missing like key components or giant red flags that would mess up an investor's trajectory. What we most commonly see are that a lot of the vendors, securities attorney, immigration lawyer, economist, business plan, all these different companies are all kind of operating in their own silo. They're all separate firms, and they're all typically being engaged and working in the project at different steps. And so what we see is kind of number one issue is version control. Just last week we saw brand name economist, but in the report the regional center name was wrong, the total raise was wrong, and that was because changes had been made since the first draft of the report till when we were provided the final draft. And so not having kind of one person to kind of oversee the different components, and that one kind of overseeing person know what to look for, you often have an issue of just everyone kind of driving on their own parallel path, but nobody really like making sure everything ties all the numbers and key terms across all the documents. It's a really easy way for USCIS to pick up on an issue when they've got one total number of investors in one document and it doesn't match in another one, or a name doesn't match. Those are really easy errors to make. So having that kind of one person who knows what they're doing to kind of vet all the final versions, make sure everything matches, that's really the one major issue that we see when we're looking at a new set of documents for a project.
Does this count? I recently reviewing several business plans, and I mean, I'm a lawyer and I probably don't do math that well, but but when I have to foot something and it just doesn't add up, it's just a problem for me. And I've come across that, and that is really a shame.
Moving on to...
Yeah, but they've hired you, Ozzy. So
I can add. I have a calculator.
Right.
Moving on to forbidden terms and the EB5 documents. Clem, can you talk about how that actually ties into the team and experiences with,
Sure. And I think we got there a little bit already. I mean, Ozzy talked about our probably number one biggest red flag word, which is guarantee. Certainly, the project can get a construction loan guarantee, and certainly the developer can give guarantees with respect to the lending source. But from a marketing perspective, a guarantee that an investor is going to get their money back or a guarantee that an investor is going to get their green card is it's not only a huge red flag about inexperience on behalf of the people doing the offering, it's also grounds for denial. And it happened. I was at an EB5 conference, walking past a booth and a project. There was someone there that said that they guaranteed to the investor that they were going to get their green card, and I stopped and then I moved on. But it does happen. It's a huge red flag. Some others that we've also talked about are redemption. Guaranteeing to the investors that they're going to get their money back at a certain date is an automatic denial. There are two more R's that I want to talk about. There's redemption, and then there's the retiring of debt or equity. There is a proper way to do this, and our clients utilize that. However, it must be done in a very specific way. EB5 had to have been contemplated from the very beginning. So if you see in the document that the EB5 money is going to be used to retire a debt or pay back equity, you should be cautious. That's definitely something that you should talk about with your immigration attorney or your attorney to see if that passes muster, and certainly something that I believe the regulators pay attention to. The third R is a rebate in the deal. Or said differently, the issuer is offering some sort of sweetener to EB5 investors in exchange for their investment.
Like a condo at the end of the day?
Like a condo at the end of the deal, which is exactly what I was thinking of. You'll often see, you won't actually often see it in the market, but I think we often see clients who come to us and say, hey, I want to give the EB5 investors, I'm building a multifamily, whatever it is, and, I'm going to give the EB5 investors a discount or a condo or this or that. Those promises are given a value at USCIS, and whatever the value of that is subtracted from their investment. So if they only gave $500,000 and they're given something worth, X, then their investment is 500 minus X.
And even if it's $1, $4.99.99, it's not good enough.
Right, exactly. A free pen, like whatever it is, and probably not that crazy.
Yeah.
But be wary of redemption language. Be wary of retiring debt or equity language. Be wary of rebates. Those are big red flags that regulators are looking for, and that investors should treat warily if/when they see them.
But could I add that the anti-red flag in the glossary of words here is fair market value?
Yes, absolutely. You can expand on that.
So I think that, the whole idea about at risk is that the money is just that, at risk. So therefore, if the valuation that you're attaching to a redemption at the end of the day is based upon fair market value, then that should be fine for all purposes.
Mm-hmm. Moving on, Ozzy, can you talk a little bit about issues you see in the way that projects are marketed and promoted?
So I wanted to talk a little bit mostly really about so-called sponsors and promoters. So who are those people? Those are the people that are interested in bringing a project on and do the beginning work to get a project off the ground. So there are times when that person, when it comes down to the end of the day, doesn't want to be in the disclosure documents, in the PPM. And Clem, I don't know if that's happened to you, but it's happened to me a couple of times. And what is the problem with that? Well, the problem is that everybody needs to be disclosed that is a key person in an offering. Why? Because we want to know all information that is material to an investor. And if an investor would make a different investment decision if they knew that that person was convicted of fraud 20 years ago, maybe it's not, a disqualifier today, but it might make a difference. Or more importantly, and Clem, I hope you could add on to this, the notion of a bad actor. When we're doing an offering these days, a bad actor could blow the exemption.
Right, absolutely. We use Regulation D and Regulation S as exemptions for our offering documents, and under the new Reg D rules, a bad actor will make will make your offering ineligible for Reg D, which means no students here on a foreign who are here on student visas, no U.S. persons, and that can definitely have an impact on the project.
Go ahead. Of course, then there's the issue of, part of our main job is actually to kick the tires and conduct due diligence. And you have to be concerned, and maybe this is really in the red flag category, but, slow to respond to due diligence. I mean, what does it take to get information out? And sometimes, that should be of concern. And then there's the issue of commissions and who's going to be earning those commissions, which is also a big issue. But I think that's perhaps enough for this one.
Next, we're going to move on to structural issues and conflicts of interest. Basically, the interrelations of the it's called regional center, NCE or new commercial enterprise, and the borrower or job creating entity. Isaac, can you also lead us on this topic?
Sure. What we're talking about now is the relationship between the new commercial enterprise and the job creating entity. In the beginning, we can say that there was just a new commercial enterprise, and that entity was both the entity that was used to raise the money and the entity that created the jobs. But I think it was Azumi that permitted a sort of split between the new commercial enterprise and the job creating entity. And when that split occurred, you have the issue of who controls both the new commercial enterprise and the job creating entity. There are times when the same persons, either directly and indirectly, control both of those entities. So in an EB-5 loan model, then you're looking at the situation where the borrower is controlled by the lender and the lender is controlled by the borrower. So it's hard to imagine where you can actually make an arm's length loan. And in fact, when you look at the various cases in this space where there have been issues of fraud, I think you can say almost without exception that they have all entailed commonly controlled JCEs and NCEs. So we wanted to lay that out for you because, well, that is a red flag as well. We wanted to lay that out to you because that is something that you should be aware of. Of course, I think that if people want to do bad things, they're going to do bad things. We do many deals where there is common control, and that's not an issue because they understand that, we have to play the game of at least creating an arm's length relationship between the borrower and the lender. And I think that's achievable. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't look at fixes in order to avoid that problem. And I think the current proposals in the legislature relating to integrity do that. So to the extent that you can, I would say, include an independent loan manager that might be responsible for solely looking after the loan, not necessarily the offering. So you can think about an NCE that is managed by a general sort of manager that deals with everything but the loan, and then the loan manager. Clem, I don't know, or anybody else wants to add something
Brian,
on that.
I know you come into projects,
Yes.
Lots of times after they already had issues, and you do a lot of the forensic accounting. So I think you probably have a lot of experience in seeing conflicts of interest and best practices to avoid those in the future.
We come in after the fact a lot. Of course, we do monitoring also, which is preventive. But the bulk of what we have been doing is responding to these disasters when they do become disasters. And $40 million has disappeared, just as an example, and they can't find the money, and you're getting this forensic calls from the regional center asking where this money went. So we come in, we basically settle down quickly, lock everything down, take all the evidence in, and go through it. And what you find is that a lot of these issues that we've all been talking about were present, but nobody ever detected them, nobody ever looked at them. The conflicts were there, the unlicensed developer was there, nobody ever looked at, or there was a bait and switch. They put somebody in, and then he's really not the developer, somebody else comes in. So which goes to show
I've
you.
seen that too.
You've seen that, I'm sure. But that tells you, just because you're doing that due diligence up front, at the front end, that it shouldn't stop there. There should be continuous monitoring throughout the project, because if they're going to do it, they're going to, of course, they're going to dress up the pig to look good, and then once the due diligence is over, they're going to come in and have another plan.
So whose responsibility is that?
Well, yeah, the lipstick goes off. Yeah,
Whose
exactly.
responsibility is that to keep monitoring?
Well, the monitoring, I think, I think that there should be continuous monitoring throughout the project, and I think the new legislation should be addressing that if it's not. And hopefully we'll get to a point where throughout the project, we will get that monitoring. And let me tell you from stats, I looked at all the frauds that we have investigated with the EB5 program, and also looked at the other ones that we haven't. So I combined them. And the bulk of the fraud incidents take place, and you probably have seen this, after the money leaves the regional center and goes to the developer. Right. It just seems to go into a dark hole, and nobody's watching it as to where it goes.
Yeah, that would be a problem.
I think this is I think this is something that the market is aware of. I think starting in 2012, and then it seems almost every 3 to 6 months, there's a new enforcement action. I think the market has begun to be aware that you should look for controls when the lender is also the developer. When he's loaning money to himself or making an investment in himself. And I think over the past couple of years, a lot of solutions have arisen in the industry. And I often advise clients who are in that situation, who are trying to do the right thing. They're certainly not con men, but are setting up their own regional center and want to raise money for their own projects. Mm-hmm. To pay the extra expense to get a third-party monitor, because it helps you sleep at night. You're not going to ask me complicated questions, in the 11th hour. Can we do this? Can we do that? And as a as a lawyer, I have to figure out what the fiduciary duties are and the duty of loyalty. Yeah. Just get a third-party monitor, have the question answered, and I frankly believe that the market will reward that as the concept of conflicts gets disseminated out into the EB5 market and to investors who are looking at this. And obviously regulators are wary of completely internal affiliate deals.
I just wanted to add one last point about the loan agreement itself. And so what we need to do, obviously, in that situation is make sure that we have a good loan agreement. And I think that it might be best to get an outside law firm to do that, other than perhaps your corporate and securities attorney, if the deal will support it. But in any event, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that, we have actual good covenants. We have conditions to funding. That's critical. Of course, we need to make sure that we have adequate collateral and that we have perfected or will perfect that collateral.
So how do you stop your client from just waiving all those conditions because they're loaning money to themselves?
That is, I'm just pointing it out.
Document. Yeah, I'll waive this, that, and the other.
Well, I think that would be a pretty clear violation of fiduciary duty. Brian, what kind of financial controls do you suggest putting in place to try to at least mitigate these concerns?
This is a big area, and it goes back to a lot of what I will share with you comes from lessons learned and what should be out there. But financial controls are really the nuts and bolts, what keeps an operation viable and healthy. It should provide a framework of processes that facilitate the attainment of the objectives of the project. These should encompass policies and procedures clearly defined that require the operational procedures should be followed in a certain way so that there's no deviation from those policies and procedures. The accounting system should be clearly defined as to what systems are being used, who's using them, and who are the people who are responsible for handling the documentation of the flow of funds and memorialization of transactions. Segregation of duties, extremely important. A lot of times when we go in and we investigate these cases, when you have fraud, segregation of duties is a huge problem because you find the same person gets the money, disperses the money, has control over so many things that they could easily commit fraud. And millions could just disappear and that money's gone and now you got to go recover that money. So that's a big problem. We talked about the third-party independent monitoring. That's a good control, of course, in projects to ensure earmarked funds for these operations are being spent appropriately and as planned. And I will add this, in our experience from what we've seen, the greater majority, almost all of them, of these EB5 projects that have had fraud in them and that were afflicted by fraud would have been protected had there been a monitoring system in place, a genuine monitoring system. And that you have to be careful. If you're going to have a monitoring team, don't bring in the ice cream man, and his crew. It's got to be, you bring. I mean, I know it's a hot area, and a lot of people are jumping into it. Make sure these guys are investigators. They have forensic accounting backgrounds. They know how to walk it through the court system. The way we do it. After we do the investigation and write up our findings, we confer with the attorneys on the case and the client. And if the client wants to push it through, we just hand walk it right into the U.S. Attorney's office.
So Ben & Jerry's won't work?
No, I don't think Ben & Jerry's is going to work. No, it's not going to happen. The biggest construction case that we had, that involved, and this raised the bell a little bit. It involved so many multiple companies, construction companies, that were so reputable, big names. And, we did the investigation. I took the findings, 700 pages. I walked it into Loretta Lynch. And I said, Loretta, here it is. And by the way, that desk that you're sitting on, that's part of the fraud. Her office was affected by the fraud. This is the Brooklyn courthouse. And I said, this is pervasive across the board. And she was pulling her hair out. So we got to be a little skeptical about the developers, no matter who they are, because it's commonplace. So that's an issue, and the monitoring I think is a huge control that can alleviate a lot of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, to the point I made earlier, which I don't think I made that well, with Ozzy's point, with getting a real loan agreement. Getting a real loan agreement is a first step. But doesn't get you all the way over the finish line, because if it's still an affiliate deal, it's possible to waive these conditions. It's possible to undo what's on paper. But a third-party monitor, someone who can actually enforce what's written with teeth, it goes a long way to giving assurance to regulators and should give assurance to investors as well.
And you said something about what's on paper. One project that we did was a luxury hotel in Florida, and not far from Mar-a-Lago. It was.
But not Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah. So they had the developer, and they had these names on paper that were submitted to the USCIS. Everything looked great, but in fact, the brother, who was a convicted criminal who had been doing this over and over again, had used his brother to be the straw man, who had no record, and that's
an EB5 case.
That's an EB5 case. Yes. So these things can happen. But when you said on paper, I just wanted to bring that up.
So
I just wanted to make a positive note, which is that
this is the red flag.
The SEC, the SEC does a lot of work, and you catch some things and you miss some things. But I would have to say and hope that the vast majority of deals are fine. But unfortunately, you have some bad actors.
So moving on to management, Brian, what do you really look for in a management team? And then specifically, how do you make sure that the management team on paper is actually the management team that's running the project, especially for an investor that...
Right. And this ties into the last topic that we just talked about, because we hit on that a little bit. For consideration of red flags, like I said, there can be a lot of bait and switch. You're told this is the group, and then suddenly you're dealing with a bunch of other people, and material is disappearing. And then by the time, unfortunately, with construction, and the majority of these projects are construction, a lot has disappeared by the time people actually start to realize. But if you have that monitoring, it would stop that. But let's just talk about the management. I have some very short notes on here about the what is this, you know, what is the background of these people that are handling the project? How many projects have they done? And how many have they done successfully? Are there criminal convictions? There should be a criminal conviction check on all of them, on every one of them. You know, have there been any SEC actions against them in other projects, right? Have there been lawsuits from private parties? Again, and were there any judgments against them? Because that goes to your reputation, right? And, you know, just a couple of other things. And are there any investigations ongoing that we're aware of, or indictments against the people that are going to do the management?
Yeah, so obviously, I'm probably for Clem as well, and Sam, I want to hear from Sam. We get compliance certificates from all of the key persons in a deal, and that includes that they're not bad actors, which I hope they can certify, or they'll have to certify, and also that they have reviewed the PPM and that there's nothing in there that's false or misleading. Clem, do you do that?
Yeah, we do that. You know, it's part of our due diligence with respect to our PPM. I'm curious to hear Sam, as a proprietor of many regional centers that does deals for developers, how you vet projects and management team members.
Yeah, so we have 15 regional centers that cover 21 states, and so we see a lot of projects. We have a lot of active projects with investors across that footprint, and so there's kind of a two-piece system. One is the initial diligence of the project, so looking at, you know, the key offering documents, the business plan, the PPM, the subscription, the offering, who are the people involved, who are the different team members involved if we didn't work on the documentation ourselves, right? So going in, do the documents meet EB5 requirements, and is it a team that we feel comfortable that's going to be able to execute on the project itself? A lot of projects don't meet our criteria, and so they're not affiliated with any one of our regional centers. But the ones that do meet our criteria, once they become part of that regional center, become sponsored by one of those 15 licenses, annually USCIS requires you to file a compliance, kind of a 924A job kind of update that's actually coming due this December. It's every December is the filing, a month and a half or so after the fiscal year end with USCIS, and that details all the activity of projects that are active with investors under the regional center, what the status is on the job creation and number of investors and activity that's happening. We kind of go well above what that requires. That's a once-a-year report. We do quarterly compliance reports on all of our projects. So every quarter, we reach out to the sponsor, to the developer, and get an update on what money's been spent, where investor funds are at that time, if there are active investors in the project, are they in escrow, or has their capital actually gone into the project, what's their immigration status, and then we have a full securities compliance form with about 30 or so questions that they sign off on every quarter over the year. So it's not a once a year, you know, filing that's required by the government, but it's a quarterly check-in, and then any project that has an investor, at least one investor, we do a physical site visit. Someone from our team goes to the actual project site, no matter where it is, at least once a year for any project that has at least one active investor, so we can see what's happening. Is there actual construction? If someone said there was construction, what's actually happening, you know, in the dirt on site, right? So it's really important to go above what the government requires, because oftentimes, like, just getting a short email once a year and not having a physical presence to see what's happening, usually that's not going to be sufficient.
Could I ask an unfair question?
Only if it's not.
So Sam, the proposed integrity measures would require regional centers to certify as to securities compliance. Do you think that's feasible?
I don't think it's feasible. No, I don't.
That's the right answer.
No. No,
unless you hire another law firm and they actually, how do you certify that somebody else's securities work is compliant? It's about due diligence. You have to kick every tire, turn over every document, virtually do the thing yourself. I think it's difficult.
So we're running out of time. Just want to open up the floor to one or two questions. Can you get the microphone?
No, we need that. He's like right in the front.
So, when we are trying to, bring people from abroad, is there a minimum education qualification that the USCIS would need for them to be, considered for this category, EB5 category, or like a minimum bachelor's or a minimum master's, or is it okay if they,
To be an immigrant investor?
Yes.
No, not that I'm aware of.
No, there's not.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Ted Gilman. I own and operate a broker-dealer, and we are active in the EB5 space. Question about regional center registration. Currently, there are very few, if any, regional center sponsors that are registered investment advisors. Is this something anybody on the panel has looked at, and do you have any opinion as to whether or not regional centers should be either state or federally registered investment advisors?
Interesting question.
I think it depends on what they do, of course, right?
In most cases, the regional center isn't the one that's typically managing the funds, right? A lot of people think, oh, regional center, they raise the money, they're going to make the loan. The regional center is just a license, effectively a permit that allows you to sponsor a project for job creation. It's typically not that entity that's, managing the flow of funds and is subscribing investors. Oftentimes it can be the same group of principals as was mentioned earlier, but that entity itself, the purpose is not to orchestrate the flow of funds into a project. So a registered investment advisor typically relates to managing funds directly, and so regional center is typically not, that entity itself is not directly managing a pool of capital.
And for the NCE, I think now they have a specific project, so they're not really doing that much advising, but once redeployment kicks in, that might become a greater issue.
It might become a greater issue if they don't already have authority to make reinvestment decisions, which is something that we're currently putting in our documents now to kind of cut off that issue.
But that's not the regional center
Again,
necessarily.
yeah,
That's
not
the new
the
commercial
regional-
enterprise,
that's the
right?
new commercial enterprise.
True. Although
To the extent
on
that
a
the general
variety-
partner of the regional center
Right, a variety
is
might
the
yield.
yeah.
Go ahead. You can make the point.
No, no, please. I'm sorry.
Well, I think we're going to wrap it up.
I would say this, though, with respect to regional centers becoming an RIA, I don't think that's necessarily appropriate because they don't give investment advice to individuals about making an investment. However, I am seeing a trend where regional centers are retaining broker-dealers and becoming registered representatives. And I'm seeing more regional centers utilize broker-dealers and or becoming broker-dealers themselves, which I think is more appropriate because they're raising money on behalf of others.
Right. I'd like to thank Clem, Brian, Ozzy,
Hi,
and Sam for being here.
I have one more question. I'm sorry.
there's two.
I've been waiting here. You didn't say me. Okay. I'm an immigration attorney. I've seen for many EB5 projects, the developers would guarantee that if the investor's I-526 is denied, they're going to reimburse the investor for their capital contribution. Do you think this kind of guarantee will raise a red flag from U.S.?
No, that is allowed.
That's allowed?
That's allowed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Well, they guarantee the return of the funds to the NCE, not to the individual investor themselves. There's a distinction.
Very
Right, but
good
the regional
explanation.
center can guarantee the refund if there is a denial of the 526. Because if there's a denial of the 526, the person isn't in the EB5 program.
That's correct. Yeah. Good point.
Yes.
It's tough to get around there.
Great. Hey, Sam,
My name's Gary Van Shafton, but do you accept the financial data that the developers send you on a quarterly basis?
Do we accept it?
Or do you have an internal audit group? Or?
Yeah, we have a separate compliance department that goes through the financials to make sure that we believe the financials and, you know, that something's actually happening there.
Good, thank you.
Any more questions? No? All right, now I'd like to thank Claire, Brian, Ozzy.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sean.
I can stand right here.
Will Clem Turner praise report?
All right, thank you all. I'd like to introduce our next panel, Rural versus Urban, EB5 Survival Payback Structure, Location, and TEA.
Thank you very much, and thank you, everybody. This is not as dull a panel as you think it is from the title, I promise. We have a very interesting set of people here, and I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves. So I'm going to start at the far end. John Lam, introduce yourself, please.
My name is John Lam from Lam Group. We are a hotel developer and hotel management, and also we own hotel.
Thank you. Payman.
Hello, my name is Payman Attari.
Can you speak into the mics, please?
Payman Attari. I'm the president and CEO of ASA Investment Advisors. We've been in the EB5 sphere for the past 5 years or so. Prior to that, I was involved in the emerging markets, so I've been involved in opening up some of the markets from Latin America to Russia and Eastern Europe. And I have to tell you that EB5 has proven to be just as challenging, and if not more so, than some of the other markets that I've been involved in.
Thank you. John.
Yes, my name is John Pratt. I'm a partner at Kurtzman, Weinker, Tutzelli, and Pratt in Miami, Florida. We primarily do litigation. We've been involved in EB5 litigation for many years. That's federal court litigation when some projects get denied, et cetera. And we do all different types of immigration litigation in federal courts. And we actually litigated the only precedent decision thus far in the Ninth Circuit on EB5, which is Chang. That's about it.
Well, it's not just about it, but...
Yeah, John's very busy these days.
Right. And Jeff, you never need any introduction.
Yeah, my name is Jeff Carr. I'm with Economic and Policy Resources. We're a service provider in the area of doing the economic and job impact studies. We also do business plans in the EB5 space and also do immigration business plans and other programs. And we've been operating in this space on a consistent basis since about 2004. So we've seen a lot of the evolution of the space over time.
Thank you. Aaron.
Yeah, good morning. I'm Aaron Goforth. I am a principal at Baker Tilly. We help on structuring EB5 offerings, the business plan, economic analysis. Baker Tilly Capital is also a registered broker-dealer, so we offer compliance and offering services to a number of our clients.
Thank you. So the main theme of this panel, the rural versus urban, is a little directed towards the investor who thinks, as we discussed in the first panel, that they should be only investing in urban, and should they invest in rural, and really what are the differences, and what kind of impact would it make to the EB5 program as it is today. So we're going to take this topic and fragment it into different sections. The first of all, I'm going to ask our different panelists. I'll start with you, Payman. The word location. When they say about a project, it's location, location, location. What are you seeing in all of the deals that you do? How far does location really matter to an investor?
Well, I think it matters in several different ways. One is, of course, that a lot of investors looking at the EB5 world, looking for an investment, when you mention New York City, when you mention Miami, when you mention Los Angeles, they immediately know it, they recognize it, they know where it is, they're getting excited and interested about making an investment in these gateway markets. So that's one of the challenges when looking at projects which are not in the gateway cities, when you're looking at whether they are in some of the secondary markets and or even rural. That in itself becomes a challenge because just immediately the investors get turned off and not interested in really even assessing a project. So from that perspective, it does matter from an investor's perspective. Something obviously that I think that the industry should work on changing. And the other, of course, is that and something perhaps I can touch on a little later on, is that obviously, location, 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 especially when it comes to any investment, of course, does differ the risk profile of the underlying investment. And so it is important, therefore, to bear that in mind in terms of evaluating projects in different cities, in different markets. They all have their own parameters, in terms of risk, which needs to be assessed for in order to assess the viability of the project.
Right, but the what we're looking at right now is a push towards urban, a push away from New York City. Jeff, you have some points on this.
Well, I was going to just amplify something that Payman said. I
Mhm.
mean, there are good places to locate a project in rural areas, and there are bad places to locate projects in rural areas. There are good places to locate projects in urban areas, and there are bad places to locate projects in urban areas.
Exactly, yes.
The issue is you want to assess the location of a project, regardless of whether it's in an urban or a rural area, based on how it affects its prospects for commercial success. If you're not going to have a project that's going to be commercially successful, you don't have a prayer of creating the jobs that are needed to support the immigration benefits of your investors. And so there's a natural, I think, inclination that Payman was talking about, that when you look at an investor in a foreign country that has, I mean, think about the knowledge that we have about China, with the exception of the people that go there chasing investors all the time. We know Beijing, we know Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, things like that. Like, the investors know New York, Chicago, Miami, Los Angeles, San Francisco. And so think about what, this whole urban-rural thing in terms of trying to find ways to create incentives for more capital to be directed into rural areas, or in the alternative, at least areas that demonstrate some degree of stress in the urban areas. We have to be sensitive to the fact of the people, of the migrants that we want to invest, and their perception of risk. So when we talk about doing EB5 reforms, kind of like what the first panel was talking about, and believe me, I had the same visceral negative reaction to reducing the job requirement in rural areas that April had when that first started to be proposed. But the fact of the matter is that unless you focus in on the things that the investors perceive that's important, like the ability to get immigration benefits, if you don't make reforms that at least are sensitive to that. I'm not saying that we make them all based upon the needs of the immigrant investor. But what I'm saying is we can't ignore it, and we seem to be doing that in both the legislative arena and in the regulatory arena now, much to the peril of undermining an otherwise very successful program and creating jobs.
I agree with you, Jeff, but as was brought up by one of the questions in the first panel, how come it's all about real estate? Surely EB5 is not about real estate. Aaron?
Yeah, so I think real estate has found a place because it's arguably easier to underwrite. So markets, hospitality markets, condo markets, there's a lot of third-party data. You can have some assurance that, your two priorities are being considered, your immigration risk and your financial risk. So with a real estate project, oftentimes there's a close nexus for the jobs potentially already have been created through construction activity. And then there's relatively easier underwriting for that type of asset, where rural projects arguably oftentimes are manufacturing and things that are less known of a quantitative asset. There's other experts on this panel that can speak to underwriting, but generally, I think the jobs associated with real estate projects make it a safer immigration investment.
And it's an easier proof, too. Because if you calculate the number of jobs for EB5 program purposes that are based on the expenditures that are needed to construct a project, it's a very easy proof at I-829 versus trying to assure investors that some level of operating revenue of a business enterprise 5 years out is going to be there. It's easier to show and demonstrate job creation, especially in this environment where if you say you're going to spend $50 million to build something, how many builders think that they're not going to spend $50 million plus about 20 to 25% nowadays?
Well, I kind of disagree with that, Jeff. I think it would be easier to show job creation in infrastructure or in manufacturing.
But infrastructure is capital heavy and labor light. Construction activity generally is very labor intensive and creates a lot of jobs. Infrastructure would be great, but what you have to do is you have to have EB5 be a lower portion of the capital stack, because when you build a road versus building a building, when you're building a road, you got a few guys driving dump trucks going back and forth to the supplies. You got some person sitting on a multi-million-dollar piece of equipment. When you're building a building, you've got lots of trades and you've got lots of skilled people, and the jobs per $1 million in construction expenditures for going vertical construction is a lot higher than if you're building a road or laying in utilities.
But aren't these just the type of jobs that Senator Grassley doesn't want to see?
I'm not going to speak for Senator Grassland.
John, I know your firm deals a lot with litigation, and while we don't want to really frighten everybody with some of the litigation cases that have come up, on a more positive note, what are you seeing as far as projects which are being litigated from urban areas as opposed to rural areas?
Again, I just like to second what Jeff said. It has to make economic sense. And if it makes economic sense, then the two risks that are present in an EB-5, which is immigration and then obviously return of capital, can be satisfied. And then the question, once you get into federal court, really is about the inputs. And it's about how do you then prove these inputs, whether it's through expenditures or whether it's through revenues, et cetera. So, from the aspect of a lot of the things that we've been involved in is actually SEC actions, whereby the SEC and now the receivers have been educated that there's a big component on EB-5, and that one of the main reasons to invest in EB-5 is actually immigration benefits rather than just capital preservation. So, and one of the things that we've been seeing is how the receivers, and especially, for example, the receiver in the JP case, which has done an amazing job, has channeled different areas in order to be able to satisfy those immigration interests. In some time, off a little bit more return of capital, for example, because the investment for a lot of these investors was to try to get this green card. As far as the dichotomy between rural and whether it's urban, to be honest with you, the cases that were involved, obviously, in JP, which I was involved in some of that, and in other cases, really mainly deals with proving, again, these inputs in order to then prove that the investors could get the EB-5 component satisfied by showing that there were enough jobs created or to be created by their capital. What happens, obviously, in SEC actions is a lot of the capital flew out of the project, and then what happens is, where the receiver successfully litigates and obtains some of that capital, there's a white knight in some cases that comes in and wants to do it. But none of these things happen without what Jeff said. Does it make economic sense? Is there going to be a return on the investment? And can the project be completed? So all of these things obviously are changing. I know Aaron has been involved in some of these areas too, and it's going to be challenging times going forward.
So we have somebody on the panel who has actually constructed a number of projects. John, how have you seen the job creation element? And I presume all of your projects are in New York City?
We mostly only invest in New York City. In New York, we are building about over 50 buildings. So right now, one of the buildings right now we're building is a Virgin Hotel. So Virgin Hotel is about 460,000 square feet entire whole block on Broadway. So a bank appraisal is about $750 million on that building. So we have about 460 loans and 80,000 square feet retails. So the job creation, the study, so we're going to create about 3,500 jobs. So beside the construction, we're going to create a lot of jobs in construction. Besides construction, only hotel and a restaurant, we have like 4 or 5 different restaurants. That all create over 1,000 jobs continue for work afterward. So I think the job creation is very important. So our company very conservative. We only want to do about 60% of even the study. You could do 3,000 change, 300 investor. We only do 200. So beside that, the location is very important. I'm in New York for doing real estate over 30 years. And the location is make the company successful or not successful because every 10 years you see the market up and you see the market down. When the market down, which city will bounce back quicker, much coming back? New York City. So I started to buy the first building in New York City. I spent $1 million on Marshall and Kent House. That's my first building. Under $1 million. Today's value is $70 million. So the Virgin, that hotel, that land, I bought it in 2012. I spent $100 million. That time, no bank financing. We spent $100 million, bought the land. And the land today is worth $300 million. So my cost, only $450 million on my cost. But appraisal already come up with $750 million. So I only borrow money, 220 million from the bank, $100 million for EB5, about 200 member, even 100 cell. When the project finishes, you only borrow 50% from the bank. You got enough to pay the bank and pay all the investor. That's cost safe. We are old time company. Our company started in 1972. I see to New York City up and down 4 times. So when the market up, we always hold the money. Our company only leverage less than 50%, all my project. So when the market down, we leverage all the way to buy in. That's why I buy $100 million worth of land in 2011, $100 million worth of land in 2012, $100 million spent in 2013. So only land value, right now we're building 1.3 million square feet in Manhattan area.
Thank you, John. Payment. Here we are. This is Manhattan. It's
Yeah.
the most.
Right.
it's
All
the-
in Manhattan.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So,
well,
but all the projects aren't in Manhattan, and that's big for
Absolutely.
argument, right?
Well,
Yeah.
you know, you said that we're going to make this panel interesting. So then let's start with that and let's put the cat amongst the pigeons. I think some of you may have already heard me talk about this before, and we've kind of alluded to it as far as economic viability of any project is concerned. Of course, that is the basis of the investment. If you're making an investment, everybody has to assess the economic viability of the project you're investing in. But at the root of this is risk, and we've talked about risk. And so, as a little background, as I'm sure many of you are aware, in the normal world of investment, there is a direct relationship between risk and reward, risk and return, right? So if the risk of the project is high, one would expect a higher return from that. The EB5 world, of course, does not work on that principle because there is no financial reward to speak of. The reward, however, is a very important one, and that is the green card and the residency that the investors go for. So when it comes to EB5 projects, we are assuming, and which is true, that the outcome or the reward of all the projects are the same, which is the green card. So the only thing the EB5 investors are left to evaluate, many of them don't, but they should, are the risks of the project, right? So the logical thing to do would be to look for projects with the lowest possible risk profile. And this is what Sam was talking about in the previous panel. So and that is the way it should be. And of course, when we're talking about projects in New York as compared to some of the secondary markets or rural projects, that is true. The risks of investments in outside markets would be higher, but the investors are not compensated for it. However, if you really think about it, the program was first, as far as the design of the program, it actually tried to compensate for that. The idea was that if the EB5 program is $1 million, you invest in a project in Manhattan, a luxury hotel, luxury development, you invest $1 million, great. But if you invest in a TEA, a targeted employment area, or in a rural area, you can reduce that by half to $500,000, which compensates the investor for taking the additional risk. So the project initially was designed to compensate for this risk. So what have we done? Markets do what they do. We've found loopholes, and in effect, as an industry, we've broken Humpty Dumpty. And so what the attempt is today for the legislators is to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So how do we do this? Well, we cannot look at the returns. There's no additional financial returns that's going to come. No project developer is going to pay any higher for EB5 funds than they are currently. So it would be to find other means of compensating the investor. One is that we've talked about is visa set-asides, and say, okay, there's a long waiting period now for regular, especially for Chinese nationals and some others that might be joining them, to have a visa set aside, which therefore they will not have this wait period. The other is the continuing differential between the investment in a urban priority area or in a rural area, which again compensates the investors for the additional risks that they will need to take in order to invest in a rural project, in a manufacturing project which has other risk parameters than a real estate project. So there are ways in which we can address this, and the idea is that find ways that can attract some of this EB5 money to go and invest in areas where it's more difficult to find financing simply because the projects are either riskier or do not have the same kind of returns as one would get in a real estate project in Manhattan, for example.
Thank you. Well said, Payman. The set-asides. Perhaps Aaron, you and Jeff could just explain what are the visa set-asides which have been introduced in the latest legislation proposals. Aaron?
So there are proposed set-asides for rural projects and urban distress projects.
That's 3,000 visas, correct?
Yeah, so you're reducing, we already have a retrogression situation with currently. Imagine taking away 30% of the visa capacity for these set-asides. So I think it would have a very strong impact to Payman's point in terms of redirecting energy for investors to be focused on these marketplaces. But it's also going to create a much more difficult situation for the rest of the marketplace. So urban distress, I think people do appreciate that because it's very similar to the new market tax credit definitions. In fact, it's 2 out of the 3 to be urban distressed. And then
in the
there's
regulations, in the proposed regulations.
In the proposed regulations.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is not law yet. This is just a proposal.
Right, right, and the whole idea, obviously, by the permanent set aside, is to the early proposals in the legislative part of the reform effort were to, if those 3,000 visas out of the 10,000 that the program gets every year weren't actually used by the rural area projects or the distressed urban projects, that they the following year would go back into the general pool and be able to be eligible to be used by but they would still get their 3,000 set-asides for that upcoming year. That dog didn't hunt.
Right, and where are we looking at for set-asides? I mean, can you give some locations? What is a typical location for a set-aside?
Well, I mean, we're going to open up a can of worms here. There's 2 types of TEAs, as Payman was talking about. One is a urban distress TEA, which meets under the reform proposals and the proposed regulations a couple of tests: poverty tests, household income test, and an unemployment rate test. Right now, current law only includes the unemployment rate test. In order to be high unemployment rate TEA in a non-rural area, okay, remember, the first cut of the apple in determining a TEA is the project located in a rural or urban area, and it's a yes or no decision. If you are in a county that's in one of the 380 some odd metropolitan statistical areas that the U.S. Office of Management and Budget of the Office of the President says is a metro area, then your only option is to do a high unemployment rate TEA. If you're in a rural area, that means you're not in a county that's counted in one of those metropolitan statistical areas. You only have one other test. You can't be located in a municipality that has 20,000 residents per the previous decennial census, which in this case is the April 2010 census. So unless you're at 19,998 residents, if you're not in a urban defined county, then your TEA for rural areas is pretty stable. Most people in the marketplace don't understand that unless the OMB redesignates a county that your project happened to be in that previously wasn't in a metro area and puts it in one for whatever reason, and they don't do this very often. Yeah. They only redefine or maybe update metro areas about once every 3 years. You're safe for 10 years until the next census. But in an urban area, you have to go through the process that the state currently determines is the way that they determine TEAs. for high unemployment rate areas. And for if it's not a county-wide unemployment rate that qualifies, if it's not a city or a village or a town-wide unemployment rate that qualifies, we have the ability to use sub-municipal regions and blend them together with a project location called census tracts or even census block groups in order to get a blended rate that might be 150% of the U.S. average. And typically states do it on the basis of last calendar year's unemployment rate data. Most departments of labor actually allocate their labor force employeds and unemployeds down to the census tract level on an annual basis. And that's how an economist knows it's spring. It's not that the days are getting longer, that the days are warming up. It's that the Labor Department allocates the employment and unemployment data to the census tracts. So what happens there then is you have to be worried if you have an unemployment rate that's close to the 150% threshold. Every year they update this data in April, May, and some states in June. There are still a few states that use July 1st to June 30th configurations. And so your TEA, if you have a substantial raise, you could lose it from year to year. You have to recertify it every year because remember, the TEA only is valid at the time the investor irrevocably invests their $500,000 or files their I-526 petition. So that's TEA 101.
Yeah, now you can see why we don't argue with Jeff when it comes to certain issues.
But TEAs are flawed.
Right, I was
They are
about to come to
flawed.
that. So it might seem an obvious question, and a lot of people do understand this. But there's a lot of people out there, Aaron, Jeff, who just don't understand. How can you have a hotel in Manhattan to be a TEA? How?
I'm glad you asked that question, Mona. A high unemployment rate TEA confuses two employment concepts in economics. It tries to determine an area based on where the jobs by place of work are at the employer and conflates it by where the workers that are in those jobs actually live. And I anticipated this question, so let's just look at the offending census tract in Lower Manhattan. It's Census Tract 99.
And we're talking Lower Manhattan, where John has some of his
Lower
projects.
Manhattan.
Okay.
And you can look at data from the Census Bureau. Actually, there's something called the longitudinal employer household dynamics data. What they do is they look at the number of jobs that are in a census tract, and then they look at where the people who hold those jobs live. And the offending census tract, at least in 2015, Census Tract 99, had 30,146 jobs in that small little area in the lower part of Manhattan. Now, it only had, out of those 30,146 jobs, only 164 people who held those jobs in that census tract actually lived there. About 60% of them, that's like 17,900 of them, commuted up to 10 miles to fill those jobs. Another 24%, or another 7,300 people, which means 85% of the people who held those jobs in that census tract commuted another 10 to 24 miles. So 85% of the people who held those jobs lived within 24 miles. The other 15%, which isn't insignificant, almost 5,000 people, lived more than 25 miles away. It's because when people hold jobs in the hotel project or where people build those hotels, they don't live in the basement or the attic of the building that they built with their families. They live where they live. And many people in Lower Manhattan that hold jobs down there live in Connecticut, Westchester County. They commute long distances. The TEA does not take that into account. It counts only the people that live there. And then we have to make it contiguous. And so everybody argues that, and Professor Friedman, you've done this, what are all those people in the offending area up in the Harlem area? What do they have to do with that unemployment? Have to do with Lower Manhattan? Well, the fact of the matter is, those offending census tracts that everybody called gerrymandered are only 8.5 miles away from ground zero at Census Tract 99. So the point is, they're well within commuting distance, but the problem is our TEA doesn't take that into account unless we're able to capture those areas where the people who actually hold the jobs live. In a world where we have new TEA reform, where we can only count the census tracts that are adjacent to the tract that where the project is located, it totally ignores the way labor markets work. And I'm on my soapbox, I know that. But the fact of the matter is, the fact of the matter is
you can jump in.
Well, and I absolutely agree with Jeff's point here, and an argument has been made by quite prominent people that the skyscrapers in Manhattan are the factories of Manhattan, where a lot of workers come and work at, and especially for the construction, and they, of course, come from the surrounding areas and the commute to do that. And absolutely. The EB5 program, though, does not prohibit the investment of EB5 funds into projects such as that. What it says is that put the $1 million in to build that luxury project in Manhattan, it creates the jobs, come on in. I think there's a difference between just the job creation aspect and actually locating a project within the distressed urban area and the impact that it has, the economic development impact that it has in that specific location in addition to the jobs that it creates. And I think that is part of the intentions of the program, to actually direct the investment to be made in those distressed areas and or rural areas where the economic impact far exceeds just the jobs that are created by that project. And again, it's not a fact of say that the EB5 should not go into luxury projects, into projects in Manhattan. Absolutely. There's just ought to be a differential in order to, first of all, accommodate the difference in risks that the investor would take for a project that's not situated in a primary market or a gateway market, and also to encourage that investor, given the other types of incentives that one might be able to put in order to take that risk and have that investment in that distressed urban area.
But if we want to help the workers, and the workers who hold the jobs in the area that's distressed, how can we have a TEA policy that doesn't capture where they live? The reason I've been told that we don't do it this way is it's too complicated. We'll extend the adjudication periods even longer. Well, so what we're going to do is we're going to essentially make policy on North Korea based on how it's going to play in rural Indiana.
John, you had a point.
Yeah, I built a hotel only in Manhattan, and as you know, I just formed an association and a president, and also we partnership with NYU, CBC. CBC is a Chinatown Penal Council, and also local community school. We take community, we want to give job to community, all to local school, training the people from the local area to go back to the hotel job. That's our big push in that issue. All my hotel is around the area. We are teaching people from the school and employ them and teach them come in. And a lot of students, they graduate, they get a job in the area. So in whole Manhattan, it's only 10 miles. So in a building in there, Jeffrey right, in Planet District, no apartment there. So Planet District is different story. They may have apartment in Bell Park, but most of rich people living there. But they have enough also a project in downtown area. We training a lot of government workers. Government workers right now singing in New York City. We have I have a personal government association. I have 35,000 workers working for me in government industry. So over 30,000 people lost their job. I was training over 10,000 people from the government industry back to the hotel industry. It's on record. So that's why we create a lot of jobs in local, and I figure for myself it's not enough. That's why I formed an association. Last Wednesday on the 8th, November 8th, it's just a party. It's over 100 hotels join my association, want to create job in local. Yeah. And there's a lot of politics coming in to help me to big push how to get more job in Manhattan. And we serve the community. And that's why we have big fight with the union. They want seniority. They may have a job for a long area. But I said, I don't care about what the job for seniority. I care about job for community, and let the people lost their job have opportunity to find a new job for. I'm an immigrant. That's why I get a job, I save my money, and start a business. I focus to get opportunity for immigrant, for community people, and also students. That's what I'll focus into.
John, Aaron, how do you feel that these big factories of the luxury buildings being the factories of the people, how do you feel that that adds credibility to the EB-5 program as you see it today? The very fact that so much has been brought forth to the urban community. So many of the visas are taken up by the urban community as opposed to rural.
Well, I do some lobbying on behalf of AILA, on behalf of the AB5 committee, and obviously there's a tension between different congressmen in different parts of the country, to be quite honest with you. And this is the whole impetus of maybe some immigration reform is that it comes into the EB5 arena. Before there was a regional center, there was EB5, and before they had that concept, and they thought 10 jobs, you're $1 million or you're $500,000. That's how they thought of it. And when you look at the legislative history of initially how the program came about, they wanted to then make the incentive of a lower investment in order to increase investment in areas where people would not invest. And obviously, some feel in Congress that I have spoken to that the program was never truly intended to be used this way. But
it has, and since it has, it's brought in 4 times the amount of money, if not more, 10 times. Nobody expected the EB5 to bring in the kind of capital that it has.
No, I completely agree.
We can really bring that.
I completely agree.
Yes.
I mean, one of the toughest things of doing when you're doing lobbying in Congress on any immigration issue is when you are meeting with a member of Congress and he says, I don't want people buying green cards. And I said, but that shouldn't be the narrative. The narrative should be the 3,000 jobs that were created in your district. And that's part of the problem that's happening in today's world, in essence, is that it depends on how you do the narrative, and I agree with you that a job is a job is a job, and regardless of where that job is created and what kind of inputs that you use, whether it's revenues, expenditures, etc., it has this ripple effect, as Jeff correctly pointed out. The job may be somewhere, but the person may be somewhere else, and not to look at the overall economics effects of the program, I think it's a naive way of looking at the program, not a realistic way, and an economic way. The only other thing that I wanted to add is, one of the things in assessing this from the perspective where I'm at is the investor needs to do some due diligence on the EB5, because if the investment is capped, or if the investment is guaranteed to be returned, immigration is going to have a problem with that. And if you don't get your immigration benefit, then you have other ripple effects too. But to answer your question, I think obviously it's our job as an industry, as lawyers and different trade organizations, to teach Congress all the positive things that EB5 is doing and will be doing, right, including increasing some of the numbers, to be honest with you, from some of the countries, especially China.
Aaron?
Yeah, it's the political construct is just unfortunate. We have a program that brings direct investment into the United States. It creates jobs for those people that decide to invest. And there's a ripple effect there too. These people bring their culture, they bring wealth with them, they educate their families here. It has an amazing benefit. And the fact that we are in this political impasse over TEA seems to be really, trying to win a battle and lose the war. We have bigger issues like visa cap, which I don't think can be taken on at this time, but there's bigger things that can be accomplished. The rural versus urban construct, I understand the realities of the political world that we're in, but if a project is a strong project that can be underwritten, that brings direct investment to the United States, it's like motherhood and apple pie. Let's get over the other piece of it. And I don't know that we need to put, excess. What the market has shifted here for a reason, because people want financial return and the immigration benefit. Right. If there's a strong project that's steel manufacturing, that could be anything that's well underwritten and creates the jobs, invest in that project. Mm-hmm. So I think in some ways, what we see today, when I started in EB5, you had fish farms, you had gold mining, you had a whole array of really kind of wonky projects that needed alternative capital. Today we're in a more sophisticated place that we have projects that are well underwritten, they're going to create the jobs, and there's a high likelihood that they're going to have their capital returned. So I don't think the evolution of the program's necessarily been a negative thing, especially if you think about the investors.
But what about those projects which really need financing and not able to get financing from alternative means, like from banks?
There's a place for that. And to John's comment earlier, this cycle will run its course, right? And there'll be people looking for EB5 for potentially first position money on a more regular basis. But there's a place for that. And we see a lot of like what I consider friends and family projects. You know, someone's from India that has connections back to a wealthy family, and they're doing a startup tech security company. There's a place for that. And I think, you know, there's should be room for those visas for everybody to participate in the program. And then the only good thing I see about this political discourse is disruption. So as much as it's nice that we've got this kind of steady state, you know, I do think there's an argument that we need diversity in the project types. But I'd rather see the market drive that than it be regulated.
Well, you know, I think just on that, of course, you know, I guess my issue is that we're defying a lot of economic rules and market rules when it comes to EB5, right? One of them is this adjustment of risk. And the fact is that if there's the same amount of money and no other incentives, I wouldn't advise any client of mine to go into a manufacturing or any project that has a higher risk than, let's say, a luxury hotel development in Manhattan. It just doesn't make any sense. So there has to be some adjustment in terms of the risk that the investor is taking and to incentivize them to take higher risk in a project. And the other is that, and I think, you know, we've alluded to it, look, this has been a very successful program. There's no doubt about it. There's a lot of money has been invested in the United States through the EB5 program. And so, but the program also has not adjusted for that. I mean, I would equate the situation the same as trying to get Hamilton tickets in New York, right? I mean, I think that, you know, the theater has a certain amount of capacity. It has a certain amount of seats. If those seats are sold, like me trying to get tickets for Hamilton, I have to now wait until 2020 before I get to see it.
They could scalp.
Right?
They could scalp tickets.
Ticket scalping, right. So, but if you're prepared to pay, as was advertised, if you send money to Channel 13, $3,000, and you get 2 tickets to Hamilton, right? So that's normal adjustment in the market. In other words, if you get to capacity and there's a lot of demand and we hit EB5 capacity as far as the number of applications are concerned back in 2011, 6 years ago we hit capacity, yet since then more and more petitions have been sold, and not sold, but have been placed. So, but the price has not gone up, right? And we are arguing the fact that we shouldn't increase the prices because we're going to dampen the market.
Should we restrict visas in certain areas? I have this question for each one of the panel. For the survival of EB5, what about the proposal of restricting how many visas, say, New York City is allowed, and how many visas Philadelphia is allowed? It's illegal. Well, if one could do that, if one could do that, what would you suggest?
Well, I wouldn't be in favor of that. I think that's, you know, I think there is a math. There's again, the market approach is that there's an adjustment for risk. And I'm absolutely in favor of, if possible, to actually expand the number of visas for EB5 because it is a program that is working. There's no doubt about that.
But even with expanding it, Payman, the argument is 70% goes to New York City and the big cities. That's not fair.
Well,
that's the whole point here.
If we have an adjustment, you see, that's where we need this adjustment for the risk, right? If there's an incentive that an EB5 investor could be shown that says, here is a project that is economically viable. It's going to create the jobs. It's going to do everything that's required to satisfy the immigration matters. But you know, it has a higher risk than investing in a project in New York City or another one of the primary kind of gateway markets. There are going to be investors who are prepared to take the advantages and incentives to invest in those types of projects and not just in New York City projects. So it really comes down to the incentive.
Don't you think the incentive could be from the project developer to offer additional return or have an equity type structure?
That would be fantastic. I mean, if anybody could persuade the project developers to actually pay more for the EB5 funds, absolutely. But there is a limit to that because it's a process to raise EB5 funds, right? So when the cost of the EB5 funding starts getting close to market costs, why would anybody go through, jump through all the hoops in order to raise EB5 funds where they could actually go to their local investors and or their bank and raise the money? So I think absolutely, I think there should be where there is some adjustment to the returns to the EB5 investors, but because of the fact that there is a limit, it's going to be difficult for EB5 investors to compete with the market.
We might end up seeing this naturally once the minimum amount is raised. John, how many large-scale luxury projects are litigated?
Well, again, and I think you need to be careful on how they structure these things because there's different litigation in different aspects. Obviously, the SEC has gotten into the game and has, as the previous panel was saying, there's construction projects where they were just completely manipulating the economics of the project and then manipulating the inputs that were going to be used. So, for example, they were saying that a construction, was going to be $100 million when it really wasn't, and they were inflating certain of the line items, etc. That's outright fraud. But some of the other things that we have seen in litigation is when a project is too eager to put a cap on that gain or to cap the how much the EB5 investor can come in because USCIS says that this has to be at risk of loss and risk of gain. And if it looks like you're putting a cap, it kind of looks like more like a loan and it could be a debt arrangement and you run afoul of EB5. So you could do all your raising and all your et cetera, but then immigration wants to deny you 100 investors. Well, that goes your $50 million on EB5 that you're not going to get through, and then you have to try to litigate. So it has different components, to be quite honest with you. Sometimes they're just too aggressive in some of the offering, on some of the documentation, in capping or looking more like a simple debt transaction. And obviously, you're dealing with the issues of within a regulated industry. And, immigration sometimes wakes up and says, well, you know what, a loan proceed that is not guaranteed by the investor's capital is no longer good when for years they were accepting it, or tenant occupancy, which was a way of calculating jobs from some real estate projects. Then it wasn't good enough anymore. They woke up one day and then that leads to litigation. But so I think honestly from the perspective of the investor, they really need to do their due diligence both in immigration, the economics of the project, and how likely is it that it's going to get approved, because that's what they want. They want the return of capital and their immigration benefit.
All right, well, before we have closing remarks, I know there's a lot of questions. Yes, could mic, please? To the mic. Professor, I know you have an issue as well.
I know you do. I think to minimize the risk.
Can you speak into the mic, please?
Did I do that? Is it working now?
Yes.
To minimize the risk for EB5 investors is, I think, infrastructure project will bring the security they're looking for. Federal government participation, municipal government participation, local, state and city governments outside of major cities. You don't build roads in the middle of Manhattan, you build them outside in rural areas. And it's just as sophisticated to build a road as it is to build a skyscraper. There's much more into building a road than into that almost as much as building a skyscraper, creating a lot of jobs. I think putting infrastructure project as the number one priority for EB5 will save the EB5, will bring federal government financing, state and municipal government participation, whichever vehicle they use, bond issue. I think that's the emphasis of our work from now on. That should be.
Jeff, you're shaking your head.
Well, I'm going to respectfully disagree. Infrastructure projects have a lower labor intensity by their nature than vertical construction. They don't generate as many jobs per $1 million of expenditure as construction projects that involve vertical construction do. It's demonstratable. What's
Trillions,
that?
not just millions of dollars, trillions.
Well, so you're going to make it up on volume, and that's okay. I mean, you have a higher volume of things, but you can't argue that infrastructure spending has the same labor intensity and the same amount of jobs created per $1 million as construction. regular vertical construction does.
And you're right, and I don't think it does. But if I may just add to what you were saying, and that's very true. But what we're looking at are ways in which EB5 funds could be used effectively, not just to create jobs, although that is the main component of it, but also to spur economic activity. Infrastructure, I mean, it certainly roads and bridges are part of infrastructure, tunnels. But there are so many just in the state that I live in Kentucky. There are, for example, so many water treatment facilities that need to be either built from scratch and or upgraded in order to provide a very, very valuable service to the community. Now, those are the kind of projects that one can structure together with the involvement of either the state agencies and or local agencies, where potentially EB5 funds could come in at the kind of current costs that EB5 comes that really make quite a lot of impact on that community. And obviously the job creation element has to be part of it. There's no doubt about it.
And it obviously addresses the uncertainty, the commercial uncertainty aspect of steering projects into rural or non-urban areas. And I completely agree with that. The other thing I wanted to say, Mona, if it's okay, is the first panel talked, and there was a question about, why should this program be successful? One of the things that we don't measure in any of our job impact studies or anything like that are the 10,000 new consumers that come in every year under the visas, where, many times these are affluent consumers. They buy houses when they establish their residency. They buy cars. They purchase lots of things to maintain their household. And the only impact study I think I know that does that is IIUSA does one, where they actually try to estimate the value to the economy of the 10,000 investors that come every year. And most projects, unless you're double counting jobs, which some studies do, most projects in the EB5 space actually create a lot more jobs than we could bring into the EB5 program eligible funding formula to go in the 10 jobs per investor math. And so one good way to deal with that is let us count all the jobs that the projects actually create.
Yeah. Professor, you had a...
Absolutely do.
Professor, you had a question or a comment? Can you speak into the mic, please? Yes. I'm sorry. Can you? Yeah.
Is that it? No.
He just doesn't want us to know he agrees.
I agree with both Jeff and this gentleman about infrastructure and the need for it. Just keep in mind that you have to deal with the political reality. And under the reform bills...
Can you speak into the mic, sorry?
Under the reform bills, the infrastructure was going to be treated as a TEA.
Right.
That's been eliminated. In addition, the reform bills provide that a NCE cannot deploy the EB5 capital to purchase municipal bonds if they're publicly available.
If they're marketable, yeah.
If they're publicly available, which most municipal bonds are. So there are ways to get around that. The question is how narrowly that will be interpreted. So certainly there's no incentive that's being proposed any longer by Congress on that issue. As far as the positive effects of the program, there's no question there's positive effects. Just keep in mind, in terms of the number of jobs that are created, all of the jobs that are created by a project are allocated to the 10 to 30% of the project that's funded by EB5.
Well, you mean from the non-EB5 capital stack? Yes.
Yes.
But the 10 jobs per investor math is not straightforward.
Oh, that I understand.
There are rules which exclude certain types of jobs that aren't sufficiently permanent, for example. If a construction project doesn't go 2 years, all the economically direct jobs are not eligible.
It's still allocating 100%. But in the other question I would have, for example, from Mr. Lamb, there's no question that his projects create a tremendous number of jobs. And the question I would have is whether, if EB5 weren't available to him, whether those projects would be able to be built and create the jobs with some other kind of capital.
Well, a lot of jobs created by the construction and also the supplies. And after finishing, we still create over 10,000 1,000 jobs in the hotel by themselves, with the restaurant, with all the pay area.
But John, his question is that if you didn't have EB5, would you not create those jobs anyway?
Well,
how has EB5 helped?
If I don't have EB5, we cannot build too many projects. That's the
Because
issue.
you could have more funds available.
It's more funds available,
invest
yes.
in new
But
projects.
because E5 help us quicker to build and create job quicker in the area.
Right, so the real question, though, is how to create an incentive for investment in the rural projects. Because as Aaron points out, they could offer a higher interest rate, but obviously, the rural projects can't afford to build to begin with. To expect them to pay a higher rate than a luxury project in an urban area, I think is
Arguably equity too, right?
Yes.
paid by whom? Paid by whom?
Developers are paying 4, 5, 6% rate of back funds. Most of it goes to migration agents.
Yes.
The investor himself gets a quarter of a point of zilch.
I understand that.
Shift this interest from migration agents.
Yeah, it's a different issue, but the other question I would have for Jeff is with respect to the idea of counting job or defining a TEA based on the commuter traffic patterns and job creation and things of that sort. If you applied that type of approach, what percentage of the projects in New York City for Manhattan, for example, would probably qualify? Would it be a high percentage or a low percentage?
Haven't done that work, but
Yeah.
if they qualify, they should qualify, Gary.
But then the question then is, if they do qualify, how is that going to facilitate the whole incentive of promoting capital in areas that can't otherwise afford
Well,
it?
I think I think the EB5 program to be designed to be a big tent for everybody. I think there are other things that you can do to encourage projects to go into distressed and rural areas, and I think the industry's been debating them, and I think the legislative proposals that have been coming off of the Hill have a wide variety of things that, not surprisingly, in an industry that has a lot of diverse interests, hit some people one way, hit other people the other way. I see the value of focusing on the immigration benefit to the rural investor and trying to do something even aside from set-asides that might encourage and lower the risk of job creation, for example. I'm not proposing that we do that because I still viscerally am concerned about reducing the job requirement, but I see the reasoning behind the argument that you might make rural projects not have to do 10 jobs per EB5 investor, maybe 8, maybe 5 to me was a negotiating point from the senator from Iowa. And you have to make the four corners of this debate buy in. You have to have the ranking member and the chairs of both judiciary committees and both chambers, or we don't have a prayer.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have a question down here.
Yeah, so quick question. There's been a lot of discussion on different types of incentives to help offset some of the potential risks associated with a high distress, urban distress, or potentially rural project. And I think, Payman, you did a great job explaining the differential or a meaningful differential, how that provides incentive. I have a question as it relates to the visa set-asides. So if indeed, and it's important because it seems that perhaps legislation discussions have kind of landed on this idea of a visa set-aside. Certainly it creates incentive so long as that increases or decreases the amount of time the investor waits for their visa. Given the numbers of investors investing in the program, at some point that also will be backlogged. Once that becomes backlogged, the incentive starts to diminish. My question to the panel would be, what is our best guess until, are we talking a couple months? Are we talking a couple years? How long will that actually provide incentive to rural projects before it's diminished because it's also backlogged?
Payman, you can start.
Well, very good question. Frankly, I don't know. It really depends on the volume and the number of petitions that are filed and actually choose to invest in projects in rural areas. So, obviously, if the minimum amount is increased as well at the same time, that's going to affect the number of investors who would be interested to invest through the program. So, it really is something we have to wait and see. If the popularity of the program continues as it is, if we're talking about 3,000 set-aside visas as compared to the 14,000 petitions that we're getting every year, currently, it won't take long before we start hitting backlogs, basically. So it's definitely it is something that I know already projects are being marketed in places like China, hoping that there is going to be this legislation. It might be a little too risky to try and assume that there is going to be any legislation at all. But in any case, I think that it's the variables are going to be very important as to how that affects the market, but it's likely that we're going to get to capacity.
And that brings up a bigger point too, right? This program was pretty inactive until the regional center pilot program was introduced.
Correct.
And how elastic is this, right? From a price perspective, from a weight line perspective, and from a risk perspective. We may regulate ourselves or advance law that just puts us to a pretty quiet room in the future if we're not careful.
Jeff?
I'm not sure I can agree 100% with the premise of your question. My concern would be that we would have these set-asides and they'd be permanent, and we wouldn't get enough deal flow for the rural or urban distress set-aside, and all we do is make the program overall smaller, because my concern is that a lot of the reform proposals that have been proposed to quote-unquote incentivize rural areas or non-urban projects have basically been driven by we have to eviscerate the deal flow in 70% of the marketplace and hope that investors will then turn to rural projects as a viable alternative. And my concern with that is that I'm not sure that the only other alternative are rural projects in the United States.
Yeah.
I'll just
Good
simply
point.
add to this. I'm not very hopeful that there's going to be any legislation.
Well,
in
yeah.
anything. So to be quite honest with you, they don't even make it permanent. They haven't even made it permanent. We're got now December. They're going to kick the can, in my view. So there's just too many competing interests at this juncture, in my mind, in Congress, in order for them to coalesce. There, even as an industry, there hasn't been a meeting of the minds, I think, in my opinion, in some of these issues. So, the problem with the backlog is a huge problem. I think that the administration, administratively, they could have done something which is counting just one investor instead of his whole family, and their support for that. But I'm just not, I think it's very good intellectual discussions of how to incentivize capital into certain areas of the economy, whether it's for projects or areas or whatever the case may be. But I just don't think that there's a meeting of the minds in Congress to do anything.
I mean, we wouldn't even be talking about set-asides, urban, rural issues if we had a sufficient number of visas. And that's fundamentally what the problem is. And when you think about it, it's almost like the program is being punished for its success.
Right.
And artificially, in my mind, because when you look at the legislation, when they said 10,000 investors, nobody, I don't think there's any support for, they thought 10,000, whatever investors plus the 2 kids and the wife and et cetera. I just don't think that there was any thought of that.
John, going back 10, 12 years, I mean, it seemed like a lot of visas. There was always a lot left over. Yeah. John, do you have any comment? All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you to the panel.